there is a name that history almost swallowed whole. Not because the man was unimportant, but because he became inconvenient. Because the people who destroyed him also wrote the first draft of what he was. And because the regime that murdered him in a prison cell then spent years explaining why it had to be done. Those explanations were mostly lies. The truth was simpler, older, and far more human than any ideology could contain. His name was Ernst Julius Günther Roehm. He was born on the 28th of November, 1887, in Munich, Bavaria, in a Germany that still had an emperor and a belief in its own future. He died on the 1st of July, 1934, in a cell at Stadelheim prison, shot by men who had once called him their comrade. He was 46 years old. Between those two dates, he built one of the most powerful paramilitary forces in European history, helped drag Adolf Hitler from a beer hall agitator to the Chancellor of Germany, and then became the one obstacle that Hitler could not simply promote or demote or ignore. A man too loyal to the original dream, too inconvenient to the new reality, and too dangerous to leave alive. This is not a story about triumph. It is a story about a man who believed completely in something, gave everything he had to that belief, and was then killed by the very person he had made powerful. If you are watching this to sleep, then settle in. The narration will be steady, unhurried, and low. There are no jump cuts here, no sudden music. Only the measured pace of history told carefully, the way it deserves to be told. We begin, as all honest histories must, not with the drama at the end, but with the quiet, ordinary world at the beginning. A boy in Bavaria, a railway official's son, a child who, by his own account, thought of almost nothing except becoming a soldier. Stay with us. This one takes the whole night. Chapter 1. The Soldier's Son. There is a particular kind of boy that 19th century Germany produced in extraordinary numbers. A boy for whom the idea of the nation was not abstract but physical, not civic but martial, something you wore like a uniform rather than carried like a belief. Ernst Roehm was one of those boys, shaped by a culture that made soldiers into ideals, and ideals into soldiers, raised in a country where the memory of the wars of German unification still rang like a bell in every schoolroom, every barracks, every military parade that moved through a provincial Bavarian street on a winter morning. He did not arrive at his obsession with military life through accident or youthful rebellion. He arrived at it the way some people arrive at a vocation, slowly, completely, and with the quiet certainty of someone who has never seriously considered any alternative. From his own memoirs, he recalled with striking directness that from childhood he had only one thought and one wish, and that was to be a soldier. There is something almost disconcerting in that kind of clarity. The life decided before it has properly begun. He was born into a family of Bavarian civil servants, a world of respectability, structured obligation, and modest ambition. His father worked for the railway administration. A steady man, a practical man, a man whose horizons were defined by duty and routine, rather than by any burning question about the shape of the world. The father was, by Ernst's own account, domineering and harsh, a man who ran the household with a kind of firm authority that left little room for softness or sentiment. Whether that domestic atmosphere pushed the young Roehm toward the military, or simply confirmed a direction he had already chosen in his own mind, is a question historians have turned over without settling. What is clear is that the household gave him an early education in hierarchy, in the idea that some people command and others obey, and that this arrangement is natural, necessary, and not to be questioned. That lesson would stay with him longer than anything his schoolmasters ever taught him. Bavaria, in the 1880s and 90s, was a world still adjusting to the reality of the new German Empire, forged only in 1871 at the Palace of Versailles, after Prussia's defeat of France. The empire was young, assertive, and deeply proud of its military tradition. And in Bavaria, this pride had a particular local flavor, a sense that Bavarian soldiers had carried their own honor into battle, and that Munich was not simply a provincial capital, but the cultural and spiritual heart of southern Germany. For a boy like Roehm, growing up in this atmosphere meant absorbing a very particular vision of manhood, one defined by physical courage, by loyalty to comrades, by the willingness to endure hardship without complaint, and by a deep contempt for what he would later call bourgeois order, the comfortable, undemanding life of men who had never been tested. He joined the German army in 1906, while still a teenager, and by 1908 had risen to the rank of lieutenant. He was, by contemporary accounts, a thoroughly competent and enthusiastic young officer, entirely at home in the hierarchies and rituals of military life. In a way that he had never been quite at home in the civilian world, the Germany that Roehm entered as a young officer was, in retrospect, already moving toward catastrophe, though almost nobody in 1908 would have described it that way. The empire was expanding, industrializing with furious speed, building a navy that alarmed Britain, pursuing colonial ambitions that alarmed France, and driven by a ruling class that was simultaneously confident in German power and deeply anxious about German security. The army in which Roehm served was a formidable institution, professionally trained, technically sophisticated, deeply traditional, and organized along class lines that were politely but firmly observed. Roehm, the son of a railway official rather than a landowner or a general, occupied a specific position in that world. He was competent enough to rise, and he did rise, but he always remained somewhat apart from the older officer class. The Junker aristocrats, whose names appeared in Prussian genealogies going back centuries. This distance would matter later. It would sharpen a resentment that he never quite put away. By the time Europe slid into war in 1914, Roehm was a seasoned officer with 8 years of military service. He was not a tall man, not a particularly impressive figure in the way that military histories sometimes describe their subjects. He was stocky and compact, with a round face that observers variously described as blunt, powerful, and in one journalist's unsentimental phrase, piggish-eyed. He had, even before the war, been wounded in training, and had taken a bullet through the cheek in an earlier encounter, leaving a scar that would become one of the most recognizable features of his face. When the war began, he was assigned to the Western Front as a company commander, and he went to it the way soldiers of his generation went, with a mixture of relief that the long waiting was finally over, and a grim conviction that what came next would demand everything they had. He was right about the demand. He was wrong, along with almost everyone else, about how long the waiting would last. The Western Front in 1914 was still a war of movement, of cavalry and ambition, of men who believed that courage and momentum would carry the day before winter arrived. By Christmas of that year, the trenches had been dug, the wire strung, the artillery positioned, and the nature of the war had been decided in a way that would not be undone for 4 more years. Roehm fought in that war and was wounded 3 separate times, a record that, whatever else one might say about him, places him firmly and undeniably in the category of men who did not observe the First World War from a safe distance. He received the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1916. These were not honorary awards. They were recognitions of specific conduct under specific conditions, conduct that his superiors judged to have been meritorious in the technical, military sense of the word. He was, in the language of his profession, a good soldier. The question that would consume the next 20 years of his life was what a good soldier was supposed to do when the war was over and the world for which he had fought turned out to be something other than what he had been told to expect. The wound at Verdun in June of 1916 was the most serious of his wartime injuries. During an assault on one of the fortification belts at Thiamont, a name that appears in the historical record as a place of extraordinary, concentrated destruction, Roehm was struck in the face, losing a significant portion of his nose. The injury was not merely painful. It was visible. For the rest of his life, his face would carry the mark of that day in a way that could not be hidden or minimized. One journalist later described him as a man whose skin was marked forever with the signs of his military vocation. And while that phrasing carries a certain literary weight, it was also literally accurate. The scarred face became, in time, part of how people read him, as a man formed by violence, accustomed to it, not frightened of it, and in some complicated way defined by it. Whether Roehm himself understood how powerfully that physical reality shaped the way others perceived him is impossible to say. What is clear is that he kept returning to the front, 3 times wounded and 3 times recovered, which tells you something about either his courage or his fatalism, or perhaps both in the same measure. By the war's end in 1918, Roehm had reached the rank of captain. He had served for 4 years in the most destructive military conflict the world had yet seen, had been personally marked by it, and had formed in those years a set of convictions about the nature of soldiers and the nature of Germany that would prove impossible to revise. He believed in the frontline soldier with the intensity of someone who had been one. He believed that the comradeship of the trenches was the truest form of human loyalty, deeper than family, more reliable than politics, beyond the comprehension of civilians who had spent the war years in offices and drawing rooms. He had absorbed, during those 4 years, a contempt for the parliamentary world, the merchant world, the world of negotiation and compromise and incremental change. He came back from the war not as a man looking for peace. He came back as a man looking for the next fight. And in Germany of 1918, 1919, and 1920, there was no shortage of available conflicts for a man in exactly that frame of mind. Chapter 2. The world that broke Germany in the autumn of 1918 was not simply a country that had lost a war. It was a country that had lost a war, it had been told, repeatedly, and with great conviction. It was winning. The gap between that official narrative and the sudden reality of armistice, territorial loss, and the humiliating conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, created a psychological rupture that ran through German society like a fault line beneath a city, not always visible on the surface, but present in everything, and eventually the source of almost everything that followed. For professional soldiers like Roehm, the rupture was particularly violent. They had not simply lost a war. In the interpretation that spread rapidly through military circles, they had been betrayed by the people at home, by socialists, by journalists, by politicians, by a civilian world that had given up before the army had been beaten in the field. This interpretation was historically false, and historians have spent the better part of a century explaining precisely why it was false. But it was not false in the way it was felt, and the feelings it generated were entirely real. Roehm was assigned to District Command 7 in Munich after the armistice, a posting that placed him at the center of the turbulent politics of post-war Bavaria. Bavaria in 1918 and 1919 was not a quiet backwater. It was a place where the collapse of the imperial order had created a genuine revolutionary situation, where left-wing socialists had taken power, where a short-lived Soviet-style council republic had been declared in the spring of 1919, and where the forces determined to suppress that revolution were organizing themselves with considerable speed and ruthless efficiency. Rome understood immediately that this was his kind of situation. He arranged for weapons to be diverted from official disposal and placed in private caches for use by right-wing paramilitaries, an act of treason against the Weimar government that he apparently regarded as an act of patriotism against the chaos of revolution. This is one of those places in the historical record where the gap between legal categories and personal conviction becomes almost vertiginous. Roehm was breaking the law. He believed he was saving Germany. The Freikorps units that proliferated across Germany in this period were the instruments through which the Weimar Republic's own enemies suppressed the revolution on its behalf. Composed primarily of veterans who could not or would not return to civilian life, they were characterized by a ferocity that alarmed even those who hired them, and by a political outlook that made no distinction between Marxism and democracy, viewing both as variations of the same fundamental weakness. Rome moved through this world with the ease of someone entirely at home in it, connecting units, arranging weapons, building relationships, and all the while holding his official position in the Reichswehr as a kind of institutional cover that gave him access and resources that a purely private actor would not have had. One historian described him in this period as the secret head of a band, a formulation that captures something real about the opacity of his activities, even if it slightly overstates the degree of central organization. What Rome was doing was less a secret conspiracy than a semi-official parallel structure tolerated by commanders who shared his politics and useful to politicians who needed plausible deniability for the violence being done on their behalf. It was in this atmosphere, fractious, dangerous, ideologically charged, constantly on the edge of open civil conflict, that Röhm met Adolf Hitler. The meeting took place on or around the 7th of March, 1919, though the precise circumstances of that first encounter appear differently in different accounts. What is reasonably established is that both men were operating in the same political and military milieu, that Rome recognized in Hitler an orator of unusual power, and a man whose political instincts aligned closely with his own on the questions that mattered to both of them, and that Hitler recognized in Rome a man with resources, connections, weapons, access to official structures that the early Nazi movement desperately needed. It was a relationship built on mutual utility from the start, which did not prevent it from also becoming genuinely warm, at least for a time. Hitler addressed Rome in the familiar form, a distinction that in the formal culture of German social interaction carried real significance, reserved for close friends and family. Of all the people Hitler is documented as having addressed that way, Rome was one of the very few outside the innermost family circle. The German Workers' Party, which would become the National Socialist German Workers' Party in April of 1920, was, in 1919, a small and unimpressive outfit, one of dozens of nationalist micro-parties that had bloomed in the wreckage of the empire. Röhm joined it and brought with him something the party could not have built on its own: a network of military contacts, a supply of weapons, and an instinctive understanding of how to organize men who had been shaped by war and were not suited to the patience of parliamentary politics. He became, in the estimate of the journalist Konrad Hayden, who investigated the early Nazi Party as a working reporter rather than a retrospective historian, arguably the best recruiting officer the party ever had. Someone who could take a man shaped by the trenches and the Freikorps and give him a political identity that felt like a continuation of the soldier's life rather than a retreat from it. This was not a trivial skill. The early Nazi Party needed that kind of recruiter desperately, and Roehm provided the function with the same dedicated efficiency he had brought to everything military. It is worth pausing here to consider something that later accounts of this period often compress or distort: the degree to which Hitler's rise in the early 1920s was genuinely a collaborative project, not the predetermined ascent of an inevitable dictator. Hitler was extraordinary in certain specific ways: as an orator, as an instinctive political reader of crowds, as a man who understood how resentment could be channeled. But he was also, in 1920, a man without resources, without a military network, without a reliable source of funds, and without official protection. Roehm provided several of those things. Without the SA, the Sturmabteilung that Roehm helped build and arm and organize, Hitler's early rallies would have been exposed to disruption and physical intimidation from opposing groups that was simply the standard operating procedure of Weimar-era political activity. The SA functioned as physical protection for a political operation that could not have survived without it. Roehm did not merely support Hitler from the outside. He was structurally embedded in Hitler's ability to operate at all. The paramilitary landscape of early 1920s Germany was complicated in ways that even specialist historians acknowledge are difficult to map with confidence. Dozens of organizations with overlapping memberships, competing loyalties, and shifting alignments were active simultaneously, and Roehm moved through this world with a fluency that suggests both genuine political skill and a certain moral flexibility, a willingness to work with and across organizational boundaries that more ideologically rigid figures could not manage. He has been described as the keeper of a secret cache of weapons in Bavaria, which is documented, and also as someone who did not hesitate to use lethal means to protect that secret, which is also documented, if less precisely. The individuals he associated with during this period included men who would later be implicated in political assassinations, not as marginal figures, but as people Roehm actively recruited into the SA because of the particular qualities their histories demonstrated. This is a part of the historical record that resists comfortable narration. It needs to be stated plainly rather than framed in a way that either softens it or converts it into something more dramatically satisfying than the raw, ambiguous reality of the thing. Bavaria, in the early 1920s, was moving toward a confrontation that would define the rest of German history, though the men moving toward it could not see exactly where they were headed. Economic crisis, political chaos, and the accumulated grievances of a generation that had fought a world war and come back to find nothing of the world they had been promised. All of it was building towards something. Roehm, in these years, was not primarily a thinker or a theorist. He was an organizer, a recruiter, a builder of structures. He believed that what Germany needed was not another political party, but a force. A physical, disciplined, armed force, capable of breaking through the institutional paralysis of the Weimar system and replacing it with something direct, something military, something that operated by the logic of the front rather than the logic of the polling booth. That conviction would shape everything he did for for the next 15 years. It would also, in the end, be the reason he died. Chapter 3: Building the Brown Tide. If you wanted to understand what the Sturmabteilung actually was in the early years of the 1920s, you would need to abandon almost every image that the word paramilitary conjures from later history and begin again from first principles. The SA did not start as a mass movement. It started as a function, specifically as the function of protecting Nazi party meetings from the kind of physical disruption that competing political organizations routinely employed against each other in the chaotic atmosphere of Weimar Germany. Before the SA existed in any organized form, Nazi meetings were vulnerable to exactly the same kind of violent interference that the Nazis themselves would later perfect as a political weapon. Roehm understood this from the beginning and set about solving the problem with the practical efficiency of a staff officer solving a logistics challenge. The men he recruited were mostly veterans, men who had come back from the trenches without the civilian skills or the civilian psychology to reintegrate smoothly into ordinary life. Men for whom the routines of peacetime felt thin and insufficient compared to the intensity of what they had been through. For these men, the SA offered something that the labour market and the political parties could not: a uniform, a hierarchy, a purpose, and the company of men who had been through the same things and did not need to explain themselves to each other. The formal designation Sturmabteilung, which translates roughly as assault detachment, was already in use by 1921, when Hitler formed his private security force in the aftermath of a violent incident in September of that year. By 1923, the organization had grown to several thousand members, concentrated primarily in and around Munich. The man tasked with its formal leadership for a period in early 1923 was Hermann Göring, a decorated fighter pilot from the First World War who brought a certain glamour to the role that Roehm, despite his own combat record, could not have provided. But it was Roehm, rather than Göring, who provided the structural foundation of the SA: the weapons, the military contacts, the organizational discipline, and the network of Freikorps connections that gave the organization its particular character. Göring's tenure as SA leader was largely a matter of public profile. The machinery that made the SA function was built and maintained by Roehm. The relationship between Roehm and Hitler in this period was close, in the way that the relationship between a military organizer and a political orator can be close when both men understand that they need each other and both are doing their best work. Hitler provided the ideology, the platform, the almost inexplicable ability to hold a room and move it and bend it toward his will. The gift that, whatever else one thinks about him, was both genuine and extraordinary. Roehm provided the organization, the muscle, the physical reality that allowed Hitler's ideas to operate in the world rather than simply being delivered to audiences and then dispersed into the air. They argued, as all close working relationships eventually do, and their arguments were usually about the same fundamental question: who controlled the SA and what was it for? Hitler's answer was consistent throughout. The SA was a political instrument, subordinate to the party, useful for intimidation and street politics, but not an end in itself. Roehm's answer was also consistent and directly contrary. The SA was a military force, the nucleus of the revolutionary army that Germany needed, and as such, it should be organized and led on military rather than political principles. This disagreement was not a personality clash or a matter of ego, though it had elements of both. It was a genuine difference of vision about the nature of the movement, and it was irreconcilable from the moment it first appeared. The beer hall putsch of the 8th and 9th of November, 1923, was the moment at which the accumulated energy of those years expressed itself in direct action and failed, decisively and publicly, in ways that would shape everything that followed. The plan, such as it was, involved seizing the Bavarian government during a meeting at a Munich beer hall, announcing a national revolution, and then marching on Berlin in the manner of Mussolini's march on Rome the previous year. Rome's role was specific and military, while Hitler confronted the Bavarian political leadership. Rome led a force of stormtroopers to seize the War Ministry building, which they did successfully and held overnight. The following morning, when Hitler and General Erich Ludendorff led the main column through Munich toward a rendezvous with Rome's forces, they encountered armed police at the Odeonsplatz. In the gunfire that followed, 16 Nazi marchers and 3 policemen died. Hitler dislocated his shoulder when he hit the ground, then was driven away from the scene, leaving Ludendorff to continue walking into the police lines. The old general alone, calm and straight-backed in one of the genuinely strange tableaus of early 20th century history. Röhm, at the War Ministry, held out for longer than Hitler's column, but once the main force had scattered, the position was untenable and he surrendered without compounding the disaster further. He was arrested, charged with high treason along with Hitler, Ludendorff, and the other putsch leaders, and tried before a Bavarian court beginning in February of 1924. The trial was, by any standard of judicial procedure, a spectacle rather than a process. Hitler was allowed to speak at extraordinary length, to cross-examine witnesses at will, and to use the courtroom as a platform for exactly the kind of political oratory that had brought him to this point in the first place. Röhm was convicted but immediately placed on probation rather than imprisoned, a leniency that reflected both the political sympathies of the Bavarian judiciary and the practical realities of a moment when half of Germany's conservative establishment shared at least some of the defendants' grievances, even if it was not prepared to endorse their methods. The aftermath of the putsch created a division that would prove permanent. Hitler emerged from his time at Landsberg Castle, where he served less than 9 months of his 5-year sentence, and spent much of that time dictating the manuscript of Mein Kampf, with a firmer conviction than ever that the path to power ran through elections and institutional manipulation rather than direct seizure. This was not moderation. It was tactical revision, the recalculation of a man who had tried one approach, watched it fail, and was adjusting his method without revising his goal. Röhm, who was not imprisoned at all, arrived at a different lesson, or rather, did not arrive at a substantially different lesson, because the experience had not fundamentally shaken his belief that what Germany needed was an organized paramilitary force capable of direct action. The two men's paths, which had run closely parallel since 1919, were beginning to diverge in ways that would take 10 more years to reach their conclusion, but were already visible if you knew where to look. In the confused period between 1924 and 1930, Röhm moved through a series of positions and crises that reveal both the limitations and the genuine complexity of his character. Stripped of his Reichswehr commission after the putsch, he spent time working jobs that bored and frustrated him, fell into financial difficulties, and in 1928 accepted a posting as a military instructor in Bolivia. A posting that, whatever its practical merits, represented a kind of exile from the German political world that had been the center of his life for a decade. His letters from Bolivia, several of which eventually reached the German press, reveal a man who was homesick in a specific way, not sentimental about family or landscape, but professionally displaced, a military organizer without a military organization to run, a political animal in a country whose politics were not his politics and whose stakes were not his stakes. He would remain in South America for roughly 2 years before being recalled by Hitler in 1930, when the spectacular electoral results of September of that year had transformed the Nazi Party from a marginal force into the second largest party in the Reichstag, and the organized national demands of the SA had grown beyond the capacity of whoever was currently attempting to manage it. The recall was a telegram dispatched from Munich to La Paz, a small bureaucratic gesture that carried the weight of everything that had gone before between these two men and everything that would come after. Roehm packed his bags, left Bolivia, and returned to Germany. He was 42 years old. The movement he had helped build from nothing was now a mass political force with hundreds of thousands of members and a genuine prospect of national power. His place in that movement was not simply as a veteran of the early years, but as the one man who had the organizational expertise, the military credibility, and the personal authority among the SA's existing leadership to take command of the force and shape it into something capable of meeting the moment. Whatever the tensions in his relationship with Hitler, and there had been real tensions, real arguments, real periods of estrangement, the telegram was also an acknowledgement that there was no one else who could do what Roehm could do. That was power of a very particular kind. And power of that kind, in the world Roehm was returning to, was exactly as safe as the man at the top decided it should be. Chapter 4. The Chief of Staff. When Roehm returned to Germany in late 1930 and formally assumed the position of Chief of Staff of the S in January of 1931, he inherited an organization that had grown with the speed and disorganization of something expanding faster than anyone had planned for. The SA by this point had approximately 70,000 members, a figure that sounds large in isolation, but that Roehm would multiply several times over in the years immediately following. The men who filled those ranks were, in many cases, the product of the depression that had followed the Wall Street crash of 1929. Unemployed young men, skilled workers whose trades had evaporated, former middle-class families who had slipped downward with a speed that left them angry and ashamed, and looking for somewhere to put that anger. The SA gave them an identity and a structure at a moment when both were desperately scarce. Roehm understood this sociological reality better than most people in the Nazi leadership. He had always been more comfortable with the lower ranks than with the officer class, something that set him apart from most of the senior Nazi figures whose social backgrounds inclined them toward the conservative establishment rather than the street. In the 18 months between January of 1931 and the middle of 1932, Roehm expanded the SA from roughly 70,000 to something approaching 2 million members. This is a figure that demands a moment of attention rather than simply being passed over. 2 million men in a paramilitary organization, uniformed, partially trained, organized into regional units, with their own chains of command, their own culture, their own internal politics. This was not simply a large organization. It was, by any reasonable measure, a private army of a size that dwarfed the official German military, which was still constrained to a force of 100,000 men under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The Reichswehr generals were not wrong to be alarmed by what Roehm was building. The industrial and business interests that were considering backing Hitler were not wrong to wonder what they were dealing with. The organization Roehm created in those years was a genuine power within the German political system, not merely a symbol of power or a useful instrument of intimidation, but an autonomous force that could, if events pushed in a particular direction, act independently of any political leadership. The essay's role in the street politics of the early 1930s is one of those topics where the language of documentary history can become complicit in a kind of normalization if it is not handled carefully. The SA disrupted communist and social democratic meetings. The SA intimidated political opponents. These formulations are accurate in the way that many accurate formulations are also insufficient. What the SA did in the years between 1930 and 1933 was engage in sustained, organized, large-scale political violence, attacks on political meetings, assaults on individuals, beatings, intimidation of Jewish businesses, interference in the functioning of institutions that the Nazi movement regarded as its enemies. This was not incidental to what the SA was. It was central to what the SA was, and Roehm organized it with the same professional attention he gave to everything else. He was not, in this, acting against his own principles. He genuinely believed that the left had to be beaten in the streets before it could be beaten at the polls, and the evidence of the early 1930s suggests that as a practical political calculation, this belief was not entirely wrong. The political environment of Germany between 1930 and 1933 is one of the most studied and debated periods in modern history, and there are genuine historiographical disagreements about how much weight to give to various factors in Hitler's eventual appointment as Chancellor in January of 1933. What is not seriously disputed is that the SA's role in the street battles of those years contributed materially to the atmosphere of crisis and disorder that made conservative elites willing to consider a Hitler chancellorship as a stabilizing measure, a calculation that would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments in modern political history. Roehm's organization was, in other words, part of the mechanism by which Hitler came to power. Not the whole of it, not even the most important part of it, but a real and substantial part. This creates a certain uncomfortable complexity in any attempt to narrate Roehm's story, because his greatest achievement was also his greatest contribution to a catastrophe that his death did nothing to prevent and may have accelerated. Within the SA's internal culture, Roehm was a figure of genuine authority and genuine personal loyalty from many of his men, the kind of loyalty that is not simply deference to rank, but something closer to identification, a sense that the leader embodies what the organization is and believes what the organization believes. He was also openly gay in an era and an ideology where that was, to put it with considerable understatement, complicated. The historical record on this is explicit and has been carefully documented by multiple biographers. Roehm made no secret of his sexuality among his close associates, corresponded about it in letters that eventually became public, and surrounded himself with men who shared his orientation among the SA's inner leadership circle. This was known to Hitler, who chose for many years to ignore it as irrelevant to Roehm's organizational usefulness. It was known to Goebbels, who attempted at various points to weaponize the information against Roehm without success, and who appears to have been genuinely shocked by Hitler's initial indifference. It was known to the SDP opposition, which published a pamphlet specifically about Roehm's homosexuality in 1932, distributing it to roughly 300,000 addresses, including clergy, lawyers, military officers, and journalists. The pamphlet caused significant public controversy. It did not end Roehm's career. Hitler kept him in position, citing the irrelevance of a man's private life to his professional conduct, a position that was strategically convenient and that Hitler would completely abandon when it became useful to do so 2 years later. The tension between Roehm and the existing German military establishment, the Reichswehr, was structural rather than personal, though it also became personal. Roehm had never made any secret of his belief that the SA should become the nucleus of a new German military, absorbing or replacing the traditional officer corps whose class-bound conservatisms he regarded with unconcealed contempt. In a letter to Walther von Reichenau, the chief liaison officer between the German army and the Nazi Party, Roehm stated with remarkable directness that he regarded the Reichswehr as essentially a training school, and that the future conduct of war would be the task of the SA. This was not a position that admitted of compromise. The Reichswehr generals heard it as a declaration of intent to make them redundant. They were not wrong. The generals had survived the Weimar Republic, navigated the chaos of 1933, and retained both their institutional independence and their professional dignity through careful management of their relationship with the new political power. Roehm was telling them essentially that all of that was temporary, that the real transformation was still coming, and that when it arrived, they would be the thing being transformed, not the agents of transformation. Roehm's vision was, at its core, a vision of permanent revolution. The idea that the seizure of political power in January of 1933 was not the end of the process, but only the beginning of it. That the real work of building the National Socialist state was still ahead, and that it would require the kind of sustained, organized, paramilitary energy that the SA represented rather than the conservative institutional consolidation that Hitler was now pursuing. He called this the Second Revolution, and he talked about it openly, provocatively, and with a candor that alarmed not only his enemies, but also people who might otherwise have been his allies. The phrase circulated through German political circles in 1933 and early 1934 with something of the effect of a threat, not because Roehm was necessarily planning an actual coup, but because the SA's size and the rhetoric of permanent revolution, taken together, gave the German army, the German industrialists, and the German conservative establishment every reason to believe that their deal with Hitler, the deal by which they had accepted his chancellorship in exchange for what they believed would be his moderation, was not as secure as they had been led to think. By the end of 1933, the SA had grown to approximately 4.5 million members. Read that number again, carefully. 4.5 million men in a single paramilitary organization in a country of roughly 66 million people. The proportions alone are extraordinary, but the numbers were not the whole of it. What made Roehm's position both powerful and precarious was the combination of that numerical mass with the ideological commitment of the organization's leadership to a program that directly contradicted the direction in which Hitler was now taking German politics. Roehm had built something so large and so ideologically committed that it was no longer simply a tool. It was a constraint, a fact on the ground that every other power center in Germany had to account for. And the man who had built it was now, for the first time, perhaps beginning to understand that the thing he had created had outgrown the position he occupied within it. The SA was too large to be led by one man in the traditional sense. It was a movement within a movement, a state within a state, and the question of what to do with it, what to do with Roehm, was no longer a question that could be deferred. Chapter 5. The Rivals Gather. The political ecology of the early Nazi state in 1933 and 1934 was an environment of almost perpetual internal competition, a world in which the formal structures of government and party were overlaid by informal networks of personal loyalty, mutual surveillance, and strategic alliance building that made the straightforward lines of an organizational chart essentially fictional. Albert Speer, observing this world from close range, described it as a place where rival factions held divergent views, spied on each other, and held each other in contempt with what he called a mixture of scorn and dislike as the prevailing mood within the party. Each major figure gathered his own circle. Each circle viewed the others with suspicion. And above all of it, Hitler maintained his position, not by resolving the competition among his subordinates, but by allowing it to continue, by being, deliberately and consciously, the one essential point of reference that all the competing factions needed to court, which meant that none of them could afford to eliminate the others without first securing Hitler's sanction for the elimination. In this world, Roehm had two enemies whose shared interest in his destruction was more dangerous than either would have been alone. The first was Hermann Göring, decorated pilot, vain and politically sophisticated, who controlled Prussia's police apparatus and had built his own power base in the state machinery that was entirely independent of the SA. The second was Heinrich Himmler, quiet, methodical, ideologically committed in a very different way from the crude street politics of the SA, who commanded the SS, which had begun as a subunit of the SA, but had been expanding steadily in power and institutional independence. Göring and Himmler did not necessarily like each other. They were, in many respects, as different from each other as two people with superficially similar ambitions could be, but they shared a clear and concrete interest in removing Roehm from the equation, and in 1933 they began working together toward that end with a degree of sustained coordination that suggests genuine tactical intelligence. The Gestapo, the secret state police, was at this stage under Göring's control in Prussia, and Göring directed it to accumulate material on Roehm's personal conduct and on the alleged political ambitions of the SA leadership. Himmler was simultaneously working through the SS intelligence apparatus, building files, noting statements, cataloguing the kind of information that could be assembled, when the moment came, into a dossier of accusation. Neither man was fabricating evidence in the sense of inventing things that had no basis in reality. Roehm's sexuality was real and documented. His talk of a second revolution was real and documented. The tensions between the SA and the army were real and documented. What Göring and Himmler were doing was less invention than selective assembly, taking the materials of Roehm's actual life and actual politics and constructing from them a narrative that could be presented to Hitler as a threat requiring decisive action. The historiographical question of how much of what they told Hitler was sincerely believed and how much was calculated manipulation is one that historians continue to debate. The answer is probably that it was both simultaneously, which is not a comfortable conclusion, but is probably the accurate one. Roehm, for his part, appears to have been aware that he had enemies, and unaware of how organized and how dangerous those enemies had become. He continued to speak openly about the Second Revolution, to make statements that alarmed the army and the industrial establishment, and to behave in his personal life with a candor that his political position could not sustain. He complained to confidants about Hitler's direction about the growing influence of conservatives and industrialists over Nazi policy, about what he saw as the betrayal of the movement's original promise. Some of these complaints were reported back to people who could use them. This was the informant-saturated atmosphere of the early Nazi state, where private remarks had a way of becoming political facts. Roehm was not naive about this in general, but he seems to have been operating on the assumption that his historical relationship with Hitler, his organizational indispensability, and the sheer mass of the SA gave him a degree of security that in fact he no longer possessed. The relationship between Roehm and Hitler in this period has been described variously by historians, and the accounts differ in ways that reflect genuine uncertainty about the private dimensions of a relationship that was conducted largely in private. What is clear from the documentary record is that Hitler had, by at least the middle of 1933, begun to hear the case against Roehm being made by Goering, Himmler, and others, and had begun to take that case seriously, in the sense of considering its implications, rather than simply dismissing it. He also hesitated, and the hesitation is important and historically interesting. Hitler and Roehm had known each other since 1919. The bond forged in the early years of the movement was not nothing. And Hitler, whatever his political ruthlessness, was also a man who understood the value of loyalty and did not discard it carelessly when there were other options available. He warned Roehm in terms that were direct enough to be understood as a warning, to moderate his public statements about the Second Revolution. He ordered the SA to take a period of leave beginning in July of 1934, a measure that was partly a concession to the army, which had been demanding a reduction in SA activities, and partly, perhaps, a genuine attempt to reduce the temperature of a situation that was becoming dangerously heated. President Paul von Hindenburg was, in early 1934, an old man, born in 1847, a veteran of 3 wars, the president of a republic he had never quite believed in, and now clearly declining. His death, which came on the 2nd of August 1934, was anticipated months in advance, and the question of what would happen to the presidency when he died was one of the central political questions of the spring and early summer of that year. Hitler wanted to combine the offices of president and chancellor, making himself head of state as well as head of government. To do this, he needed the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the army. And the army, through its generals, had made its position clear. It would support Hitler's assumption of the presidency, but it needed assurance that the SA would be brought firmly under control, and that Roehm's ambitions for a revolutionary new military would be decisively ended. This was the deal that sealed Roehm's fate. Not a plot, not a conspiracy, not anything Roehm had actually done, but the terms of a transaction between Hitler and the Reichswehr, in which Roehm was the price. The role of Goering and Himmler in the final months before the purge was decisive in terms of execution, if not in terms of the fundamental political logic. It was Goering who controlled much of the police apparatus that would be used in the operation. It was Himmler's SS that would carry out the actual killings. And it was both men together, along with Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's chief of intelligence, who had been building the intelligence case, who made the final presentation to Hitler in late June of 1934 of what they described as evidence of an SA coup plot. The nature of this alleged plot, and the degree to which it had any reality beyond the fears and calculations of the men presenting the evidence, is one of the more genuinely contested questions in the historiography of this period. The consensus among historians who have examined the available evidence is that no actual coup was being planned, that Rome's talk of a second revolution was political rhetoric rather than operational planning, and that the SA's activities in June of 1934 were not consistent with an organization preparing for a coordinated seizure of power. But this historical judgment, arrived at over decades of careful scholarship, was not available to anyone in Germany in late June of 1934, and the question of what Hitler actually believed, as distinct from what he was told and what he subsequently claimed to have been told, remains genuinely open. What is clear is that by the final week of June 1934, the decision had been made. Roehm was at a hotel at Bad Wiessee, a Bavarian spa resort south of Munich, taking what he apparently believed was an ordinary summer holiday, which also happened to be the mandated leave that Hitler had ordered for the SA. He was, by the accounts of those present, entirely unaware of what was coming. He had no particular security precautions in place, no intelligence warning, no sense that the men who had been his comrades for 15 years were at that moment drawing up lists and preparing vehicles and loading weapons. He went to bed on the night of the 29th of June, 1934, in a resort hotel by a lake in Bavaria, in the country he had spent his adult life trying to transform. He did not know that he would never see another morning as a free man. Chapter 6, The Night They Came. The morning of the 30th of June, 1934, began before dawn. Hitler had flown to Munich from Bad Godesberg, where he had spent the previous day dealing with a labor dispute, in a manner that gave him a documented alibi of public activity. Arriving at Munich's Oberwiesenfeld airfield in the early hours, he was met by Goering's and Himmler's representatives, and by senior police officials, and the convoy moved through Munich in the pre-dawn darkness toward Bad Wiessee, roughly 50 kilometers to the south. What happened on that drive, and what was in Hitler's mind during it, has been the subject of extended retrospective reconstruction by historians and by participants, some of whose accounts are unreliable for the obvious reason that they were written by people with strong interests in presenting themselves, and their decisions in the most favorable possible light. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that by the time Hitler arrived at the pension Hanselbauer, the hotel where Roehm and other SA leaders were staying, the operational plan was in motion, and the decision to kill rather than merely arrest was already in effect, at least for the inner circle of SA leadership. Roehm was woken by Hitler himself, according to the accounts that have been preserved, and was initially addressed with the familiarity of their long acquaintance before being placed under arrest. The scene has the quality of a historical tableau. The two men who had met in a Munich cellar in 1919 and spent 15 years building something together, now facing each other across the unbridgeable distance of what was about to happen, whether Hitler said anything that acknowledged the history between them. Whether there was any moment of hesitation or regret is something the sources do not reliably preserve. What the sources do record is that Roehm was taken to Stadelheim prison in Munich, and that other SA leaders arrested at Bad Wiessee and at other locations across Bavaria and Germany that same day were, in many cases, shot almost immediately upon capture. Across Germany, the operation ran simultaneously, coordinated through Göring's police apparatus in Prussia and through SS units in other regions. The list of those to be killed was not limited to the SA leadership. The purge was used to settle a range of political accounts that had nothing to do with any SA coup plot. Among them, the murders of General Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's immediate predecessor as Chancellor, and his wife, killed in their home by SS men who presented themselves at the door on a pretext. And Gregor Strasser, the former Nazi Party official who had broken with Hitler in 1932, and who represented in some minds an alternative Nazi future that was now being eliminated, along with every other alternative. The total number of people killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives has been estimated by various historians at between 70 and more than 100, with the upper figures reflecting the difficulty of accounting for all the killings that took place in the confusion of those days, including executions that were carried out locally by SS units without central recording. Roehm himself was not killed on the night of the 30th. He remained in his cell at Stadelheim for 2 days, while Hitler apparently continued to hesitate, or appeared to hesitate, which in retrospect may have been the same as actually hesitating, given the genuine weight of their shared history. Accounts suggest that there was internal pressure from Göring and Himmler to carry out the execution without further delay, and that Hitler's continued delay frustrated the operational logic of the purge, which depended on presenting the killings as a coordinated response to an imminent threat, rather than a methodical political elimination. On the 1st of July 1934, a Sunday, SS Gruppenführer Theodor Eicke arrived at Stadelheim with his adjutant Michael Lippert. They brought a pistol and placed it in Roehm's cell, giving him an opportunity to take his own life. He refused. The accounts of what he said at that moment vary, but they agree that he declined the offered means and stated, in terms that were characteristically direct, that if he was to die, Hitler should do it himself. He was shot in his cell shortly after midday. The official justification released in the days following the purge was built around 2 pillars: the claim that Roehm had been organizing a coup and the public exposure of the homosexuality within the SA leadership, something that the regime had known and tolerated for years and was now presenting as a revelation of moral degeneracy. The hypocrisy of this second justification was transparent to anyone who had been following German politics for the previous decade, and there is evidence that some observers at the time recognized it for what it was. But the regime's control of information was already sufficiently advanced that the official narrative could be circulated without effective challenge, and the combination of alleged treason and alleged immorality was calibrated to reach the 2 audiences whose acquiescence was most necessary: the army, which needed reassurance that the SA threat was over, and the German public, which needed a reason to accept that the Chancellor had ordered the murder of his oldest comrade and dozens of other people without any legal process whatsoever. The Reichstag, the German parliament, which by this point had been stripped of most of its genuine legislative function, subsequently passed legislation declaring the killings legal after the fact. This post hoc legalization was presented as a confirmation of the legitimacy of what had been done, and in the formal legal architecture of the Third Reich, it functioned as such. What it actually demonstrated was something rather different: that the rule of law in Germany had ceased to function in any meaningful sense, that the state could kill its citizens with Auffahrtsprozess and then legislate the killing into legality, and that the institutions which might have resisted this transformation had already been sufficiently captured or intimidated to provide it with a formal stamp of approval. Hitler had given a public speech on the 13th of July, 1934, to the Reichstag, defending the purge and claiming personal responsibility for the orders. He described himself as the supreme judge of the German people. The phrase was not metaphorical. It was a statement of fact about the nature of the political order that had now been established, The effect of the purge on the broader political landscape of Germany was swift and decisive in ways that went well beyond the SA. The SS emerged from the Night of the Long Knives as the dominant security organization of the Nazi state, no longer nominally subordinate to the SA, but now clearly the leading instrument of state violence and internal surveillance, answerable directly to Hitler through Himmler. The army received the assurance it had requested regarding the SA, and on the 2nd of August, 1934, when Hindenburg died as expected, the German military swore a personal oath of loyalty directly to Hitler, not to the German state, not to the constitution, but to Adolf Hitler by name. This oath would have consequences that stretched across the next 11 years, and the most destructive war in human history. The deal that sealed Rome's fate also sealed the deal that bound the German military to Hitler personally, and historians who have traced the failure of the army's internal resistance to Hitler in the years that followed have consistently pointed to this oath as a central part of the explanation. Roehm died in this reading not only as the victim of a power struggle, but as a fulcrum point on which the entire subsequent history turned. What happened to the SA after the purge was not dissolution, but reduction, a profound diminishment of power and independence that left the organization continuing to exist in a degraded form until the war's end. The 4.5 million men whom Rome had recruited and organized did not disappear. Their uniforms continued to appear at Nazi rallies. Their participation in the organized brutality of 1938, what became known as the November pogroms, would demonstrate that the SA retained its capacity for organized mob violence, even after its political and military ambitions had been crushed. But it was no longer a power center. It was a prop. Roehm had built it into something that threatened to be autonomous, and the Night of the Long Knives was the answer to that threat. After July of 1934, the SA was precisely what Hitler had always said it should be: a subordinate instrument, useful for specific functions, entirely without independent political agency. Ernst Roehm was buried, after his execution, in a manner that combined the practical requirements of state secrecy with the awkward reality that a man of his prominence could not be simply made to disappear without some acknowledgement. He was posthumously declared a traitor, his name removed from the honorifics and commemorations that had been associated with it, his memory officially recast in the terms that his killers had chosen. None of this, of course, has anything to do with historical truth. It is simply what powerful states do to the people they have killed, when those people were also once their allies. The story of Ernst Roehm does not end cleanly. It ends in a prison cell on a Sunday afternoon in Munich, with a pistol refused and a bullet fired, and then in the long, slow works of historians trying to recover from the official version something closer to the reality of a complicated, violent, genuine, and genuinely troubling human life. That work continues, and so does this story. Chapter 7, The Machine Rome Built. To understand why the SA mattered so deeply, and why its destruction, or rather its domestication, was such a turning point in the history of the Third Reich, you have to spend some time inside the organization itself. Not at the level of its leaders and their rivalries, but at the level of its structure, its culture, and the daily lived experience of the millions of men who wore its brown uniform through the years of the Weimar Republic's final convulsions. The SA was not, at any point in its history, a simple thing. It was a layered organization with different meanings for different people within it. A political instrument for the party leadership, a military structure for the officer cadre, a social network for the rank and file, and a culture of masculine solidarity that offered men who had lost almost everything else a community, an identity, and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Historians who treat the SA purely as a political and operational entity miss something essential about why it grew as fast as it did, and why it retained the loyalty of its members, even after the political world around it had shifted in ways that made the original promise of the Second Revolution increasingly hollow. The organizational structure that Roehm imposed on the SA after his return from Bolivia in 1930 was built explicitly on military lines, adapted for the political conditions of the Weimar Republic rather than the operational demands of a conventional army. The basic unit was the Shah, roughly equivalent to a squad, a small group of men who drilled together, lived near each other, and functioned as a social unit as much as a military one. These squads aggregated upward through Truppen, Sturm, Sturmbahn, and Standarten, a hierarchy of escalating size and responsibility that mirrored the structure of a conventional military force, while existing entirely outside the formal military establishment. Each level of the hierarchy had its own leadership, its own internal culture, its own rituals of induction and advancement. Roehm oversaw the entire structure as chief of staff, but the organization's actual function depended on the thousands of local commanders who ran their units with varying degrees of competence, discipline, and ideological commitment. This variability was both the organization's strength and its weakness. It made the SA genuinely rooted in local communities across Germany, with officers who knew their men personally, and men who understood their locality in ways that no centralized apparatus could replicate. It also meant that the quality of leadership and the nature of the organization's activities varied enormously from one region to the next. The SA's training regime under Roehm was a careful balance between the military credibility he wanted to project and the legal constraints under which any private paramilitary organization had to operate in Weimar Germany. Full military training, weapons handling, tactical exercises, coordinated maneuver was conducted semi-covertly, often under the cover of sports organizations and hiking clubs, exploiting the broad grey area in Weimar law between what was clearly prohibited and what was clearly permitted. The official activities of local SA units included athletic competitions, marching exercises, political meetings, and the distribution of party literature. The unofficial activities went considerably further, and the boundary between the two categories was deliberately maintained as porous enough to provide plausible deniability for the organization's leadership when questions were asked by Reichswehr officers or government officials who already knew perfectly well what was actually happening, but needed to be given something to formally accept as an answer. This was the operating logic of the SA's existence in a constitutional state. Not deception in the crude sense, but institutional theatre. A shared fiction maintained by all parties, because all parties found it useful to maintain. The men who filled the SA's ranks were, by the early 1930s, a genuinely diverse cross-section of German male society, though they shared certain characteristics that made them distinctively susceptible to the organization's appeal. Unemployment was the most visible of these. The depression that followed 1929 had devastated the German economy with particular brutality, and by 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were officially unemployed, with the real figure almost certainly higher when part-time and informal workers were counted. For young men in particular, those in their late teens and 20s, who had never had a proper job, who had grown up in households where their father's status had been destroyed by inflation and then depression. The essay offered something that the formal economy could not: a daily structure, a sense of belonging, and the experience of being part of something large and purposeful. The brown uniform was, for many of these men, the first uniform they had ever worn that gave them any kind of status, and the psychological significance of that should not be underestimated in any analysis of the essay's growth. The financial arrangements that sustained the essay were a recurring source of tension between Rome's headquarters and the Nazi Party's central administration. The essay needed money to feed its men, house its officers, maintain its equipment, and produce the uniforms and insignia that were central to its visual identity. The party needed money for its own operations, its electoral campaigns, and the various personal and organizational ambitions of its leadership. These two pools of need drew from the same sources: membership dues, donations from businessmen and industrialists, and, in the early years, whatever could be improvised through the informal networks that both Hitler and Roehm maintained. The financial arrangements were never entirely settled and were a source of resentment in both directions. The essay feeling that it was being underfunded relative to its importance, the party apparatus feeling that the essay's demands were insatiable and poorly accounted for. Rome's financial management was not, by any account, his strongest skill. He was an organizer of men rather than an administrator of budgets, and the books of the essay at various points reflected this distinction in ways that his enemies were careful to document. The question of what the essay was supposed to be for, in the event of an actual Nazi seizure of power, was one that Roehm answered clearly, and his colleagues in the party leadership answered quite differently. Roehm, the answer was straightforward. The SA would become the new German military, absorbing the functions of the Reichswehr, incorporating its professional expertise into a revolutionary force defined by ideological commitment rather than class origin, and led by men who had proved themselves in the street battles of the Weimar years, rather than in the comfortable academies and staff colleges of the old officer corps. For Hitler, for Goering, and for the conservative allies, whose support was essential to the consolidation of power, the answer was equally clear. The essay's role was to support the political movement, not to replace the state's military institutions. These two visions were not reconcilable through negotiation. They required one side to abandon its position entirely, and the side that abandoned its position would also necessarily be surrendering the organizational rationale for its continued existence at the scale Roehm had created. The daily culture of the SA in its peak years, roughly 1931 through 1933, was shaped by the combination of martial discipline, political ideology, and masculine camaraderie that Roehm had built into the organization's foundations. SA men ate together, trained together, attended rallies together, and in many cases lived together in SA barracks, communal residential facilities that reinforced the organization's total claim on its members' identity and loyalty. The casino, the officers' mess, was the social center of SA life at the leadership level, a space where the rituals of military hierarchy were enacted in civilian circumstances, where the culture of frontline soldiering was maintained as a living tradition rather than a memory, and where Roehm's particular vision of the soldiers' community, the Männerbund, the brotherhood of warriors, was practiced rather than simply preached. For Roehm, these communities were not merely organizational conveniences. They were the realization of everything he believed about the nature of human loyalty and the basis of genuine political community. When the SA was dismantled as a power center after the Night of the Long Knives. It was not only a political force that was reduced, it was a social world. Hundreds of thousands of men's daily lives that was permanently altered. By the time of the Night of the Long Knives, the SA's infrastructure was enormous. Training grounds, barracks facilities, supply chains, communications networks, administrative offices across every region of Germany. This infrastructure did not vanish in July of 1934. It was reorganized, redirected, and gradually absorbed into the expanding state apparatus of the Third Reich. Many SS officers continued in various party and state functions. Many SA men simply transferred their energies into the other organizations that the Nazi state was expanding in this period. The organization itself continued to exist, reduced in status and purpose, until the end of the Second World War. But the SA that existed after 1934 was a shell of what Roehm had built, an organization that retained its name and some of its visual symbolism, while having been stripped of everything that Roehm had understood to be its essential nature. It is possible to see this outcome as a kind of posthumous refutation of everything Roehm stood for. The demonstration, in institutional form, that his vision of the Second Revolution was never going to happen. Or it is possible to see it as simply the fate of all revolutionary instruments that outlive the revolutionary moment. They are kept in place, maintained as symbols, and slowly emptied of content. Both readings are probably partially accurate, which is the condition of most historical judgments that survive serious scrutiny. The legacy of the SA as a social institution, as opposed to its legacy as a political or military organization, deserves more attention than it typically receives in histories of this period. The organization's role in normalizing the use of organized violence as a political tool, in socializing a generation of German men into a culture that treated brutality as virtuous and loyalty to the group as the highest obligation, was not simply erased when the SA's political power was broken. The men Roehm recruited and trained and shaped did not unlearn what they had been taught. They carried those lessons into the Wehrmacht, the SS, the civil administration, and the occupied territories of the Second World War. The specific ideological content of the SA's worldview was, in many respects, less consequential than the behavioral patterns it established. The habit of collective action in service of political goals, the normalization of violence as a first resort rather than a last one, and the dehumanization of designated enemies that the SA's culture had practiced and refined over more than a decade of street politics. These were the things that outlasted Roehm. These were the things that mattered. Chapter 8. What Roehm believed. There is a temptation in narrating the life of a figure as violent and as ultimately destroyed as Ernst Roehm, to reduce him to his function, to treat him primarily as an organizer, a recruiter, a builder of the machine that enabled Hitler's rise, and to leave the question of what he actually believed to one side, as if the beliefs were either obvious or irrelevant. This reduction is a mistake, both historically and as a matter of honest narrative. Roehm had beliefs. They were specific and consistent over time, held with the kind of intensity that comes from having staked one's entire adult life on their truth, and they were genuinely distinct in important ways from the beliefs of his colleagues in the Nazi leadership. Understanding what he believed, not sympathetically, not apologetically, but clearly, is essential to understanding why he died the way he did and why his death mattered in the way that it did to the subsequent history of Germany and of Europe. The foundation of Roehm's political thinking was what historians of this period sometimes call soldatischer Nationalismus, a Soldiers' nationalism, a nationalism rooted not in ideology in the intellectual sense, but in the experience of the front, in the idea that the nation was constituted not by its cultural products or its parliamentary institutions, but by the men who had bled for it and been changed by that bleeding into something that civilians could not fully understand. This was not a unique position in the Germany of the 1920s. It was, in fact, one of the most widespread strains of political feeling in the Weimar Republic, shared across the spectrum of nationalist politics, from the moderate veterans organizations to the most extreme paramilitaries. What made Roehm's version of it distinctive was the degree to which he made the soldiers' community, the brotherhood of the front, not merely a political metaphor, but a literal organizational principle, something to be recreated in peacetime, rather than simply mourned as a lost past. His relationship with the SA was, in this sense, not simply a professional matter. He regarded the organization as the living embodiment of the front community, the front Kameradschaft, transplanted into the conditions of political struggle. The SA was not a means to a political end for Rome in the way that it was a means to a political end for Hitler. It was the end itself, or at least an essential part of the end. The society Rome wanted to build was one organized along military lines, governed by the values of the soldier, rather than the bureaucrat or the politician, in which the hierarchies of rank and loyalty that the trenches had created would replace the hierarchies of class and money that the Wilhelmine Empire had maintained. This vision was, as various historians have noted, internally contradictory in ways that Rome either did not see or chose not to examine. A society organized along military lines is still a hierarchy. The men at the top of such a hierarchy would still have disproportionate power and comfort compared to the men at the bottom. The notion that the camaraderie of the front could be scaled to an entire society without generating the same inequalities and resentments that it was supposed to replace is, in retrospect, obviously untenable. But Rome believed it with the conviction of a man who had experienced the front community as the most real and meaningful thing in his life, and who could not accept that this experience did not translate into a political program. His views on the economy were less developed than his views on military organization, which was consistent with his background and temperament, but also reflected a genuine gap in his political thinking that made him more dependent on others for economic policy than he was comfortable acknowledging. He shared the broadly anti-capitalist orientation that ran through the more radical wing of the Nazi movement, the wing associated with Gregor Strasser and his brother Otto before Gregor's break with Hitler in 1932, which held that the Nazi revolution should not simply be a political revolution, but an economic one, a genuine redistribution of power and resources away from the industrial and financial establishment toward the working people who had fought the war and suffered the depression. Rome's version of this anti-capitalism was less theoretically developed than the Strasserist program and more visceral, a contempt for men of money and comfort that had its roots in his own experience of class exclusion within the officer corps and his observations of the gap between the suffering of ordinary soldiers and the comfort of those who had managed the war from behind the lines. He called for the nationalization of major industries on various occasions and spoke of the need to break the power of reactionary economic forces, language that alarmed the industrialists and financiers whose support Hitler was carefully cultivating in the early 1930s, and that contributed to the sense among those groups that Rome's continued influence over the movement was a threat to their interests. The question of how Rome understood his own position within the Nazi movement is one of those historiographical puzzles that cannot be fully resolved, because the primary source, Rome himself, was killed before anyone with genuinely disinterested motives had the opportunity to systematically record his views. His published memoir, Geschichte eines Hochverräters, The Story of a Traitor, published in 1928, is the most substantial first-person account of his political development. And it is a revealing document, more self-aware in some respects than most memoir literature of this kind. He describes himself with notable candor as someone who is not in politics from conviction in the conventional sense, but from the need to find a vehicle for the military and national renewal he believed Germany required. This formulation is interesting precisely because it is honest, or at least as honest as memoirs ever are, about the fact that his relationship to politics was instrumental rather than ideological, in the way that most of his colleagues' relationships to politics were ideological. He was not, primarily, a theorist of race, or a student of geopolitics, or a thinker about the nature of the state. He was a soldier who had decided that political action was the necessary path to military renewal, and who engaged with the political world on those terms. His relationship with Hitler was, on this reading, always a relationship between two people who needed each other for different reasons, and who understood their collaboration in fundamentally different terms. For Hitler, Rome was a resource, extraordinarily valuable in the years when the movement needed his organizational skills and his military networks, and increasingly costly when the movement had reached the stage at which those skills mattered less than the political liability they had become. For Röhm, Hitler was something more complicated, a leader he genuinely admired for his oratorical gifts and his political instincts, a comrade of the early years, with whom he had shared the genuine risks of the putsch and the genuine difficulty of the movement's lean years, and also, increasingly, a man whose political evolution was taking the movement in a direction that Rome found deeply unsatisfying. The personal loyalty was real. The political divergence was also real. And in the world of the early Nazi state, the political divergence was the thing that killed him, while the personal loyalty was the thing that made his death somewhat, very slightly, very temporarily, hesitate. The historiographical debate about whether Röhm represented a meaningfully different form of National Socialism, one that was less race-chiefly focused, more economically radical, and more genuinely revolutionary, or whether this distinction is largely retrospective, mythology constructed by people looking for a good Nazi or a better. Fascism is a genuine and important debate that this script cannot resolve in a paragraph. What can be said with some confidence is that the differences between Rome's vision and the direction that the Nazi state took after his death were real, that they were significant in terms of who would have suffered and how under each scenario, and that the elimination of the SA's power in July of 1934 was also the elimination of the most organized left populist tendency within the Nazi movement itself. Whether what replaced it was better or worse in any meaningful moral sense is a question that historians answer differently. And the honest position is that both the SA's ideology and the subsequent direction of the Nazi state were catastrophic in ways that make comparative moral assessment more or less beside the point. One element of Roehm's worldview that requires explicit and careful treatment is his relationship to anti-Semitism, the ideology that was, in historical retrospect, the most defining and most consequential feature of the movement he served. The evidence on this is less straightforward than it might appear. Roehm was a member of a movement that was explicitly and virulently anti-Semitic from its earliest days. He participated in a political culture that treated anti-Semitism as foundational rather than peripheral. He built and commanded an organization that engaged in anti-Semitic violence as part of its normal political activities. None of this is contested. What is less clear from the available sources is the degree to which anti-Semitism was a personally held conviction for Roehm versus a cultural, ambient element of the world he inhabited. His memoir and his letters do not place the same emphasis on racial ideology as the writings of Hitler, Himmler, or Goebbels. His concerns, as expressed in his own words, were primarily military and organizational rather than racial, whether this represents a genuine difference in ideological commitments or simply a difference in emphasis. The soldier's way of leaving the ideological framework assumed rather than stated is a question that the sources cannot definitively settle, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that uncertainty, rather than resolving it in either the apologetic or the condemnatory direction. Chapter 9. The Republic Against Itself, the Weimar Republic, is one of those historical subjects that has generated more retrospective mythology than almost any other comparable period in modern history. And the mythology runs in two opposite directions simultaneously, which tells you something about the nature of the reality it is trying to capture. In one version, Weimar was a golden age of cultural creativity and liberal possibility, a brief flowering of modernism and democratic experiment between the authoritarianism of the empire and the horror of the Third Reich, destroyed by the economic catastrophe of the Depression and the political incompetence of those who failed to defend it. In the other version, Weimar was doomed from the start, built on the contradiction of a democratic constitution imposed on a society that had not democratized, sustained by compromises that satisfied nobody, and carrying within itself from its first days the seeds of the collapse that eventually came. Both versions contain real elements of the truth. Neither is sufficient on its own. And Ernst Roehm's career inside the Weimar Republic illustrates, with unusual clarity, the ways in which both versions miss something important about what the Republic actually was. The Republic was created in the chaos of November 1918, not by revolutionaries who had planned it, but by moderate social democrats who found themselves in possession of power they had not sought and in circumstances they had not chosen, confronted with a revolutionary situation on the streets and a military-industrial establishment that had just lost a world war and was looking for someone else to blame for the outcome. The constitution that emerged from the National Assembly at Weimar in 1919 was a genuinely sophisticated document, more sophisticated in many respects than the political culture in which it had to operate. It provided for proportional representation, which meant that the Reichstag reflected German society with a precision that the first past-the-post system of Britain never achieved. And this precision turned out to be a weakness as much as a strength, because it meant that the Reichstag also reflected all the fractures and contradictions of German society with equal fidelity, making stable majorities extremely difficult to construct and coalition governments chronically unstable. Röhm operated within this unstable system, not as a democratic actor. He made no pretense of believing in parliamentary democracy, but as one of the many extra-constitutional forces that used the Republic's legal framework as cover for activities that were fundamentally designed to undermine it. This is not a paradox unique to Rome or to the Nazi movement. The Weimar Republic was, from fairly early in its history, simultaneously defending its constitutional order against enemies who used that same constitutional order as the ground from which to attack it. The Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, was similarly situated, accepting the Republic's legal framework when it was useful and operating outside it when that was useful, never genuinely committed to the parliamentary system it participated in. The difference was that the right-wing paramilitaries, including the SA, received a degree of tolerance from the Republic's own law enforcement apparatus that the left never received, a reflection of the political sympathies of the police forces, the judiciary, and the civil service that had been inherited from the imperial state and never fully democratized. The elections of September 1930, the first national elections in which the Nazi Party scored a result that compelled the rest of German politics to take it seriously, transformed the political landscape in ways that Röhm understood immediately, and that energized the SA at precisely the moment when the organization was being handed to him for rebuilding. The Nazis had gone from roughly 800,000 votes in the elections of May 1928 to more than 6 million in September of 1930, from a marginal party to the second largest party in the Reichstag in a single election cycle. This was not simply an organizational achievement, though the party's organizational work in the intervening period was genuinely impressive. It was primarily a response to the economic crisis that had struck Germany with particular force after the Wall Street crash of October 1929, and that had already, within a year, produced mass unemployment and the collapse of the moderate Centre Party's credibility with a public that was looking for anyone who seemed to offer an alternative to the incrementalism and compromise of parliamentary politics. The SA's visibility in the streets, its physical presence at rallies and demonstrations, and its role in the political violence that accompanied the election campaign all contributed to the image of a movement that was, whatever else one might say about it, doing something that had energy and direction and certainty in a world where everything else seemed to be failing. The period between September of 1930 and January of 1933, the period during which Hitler went from leader of the second largest party to Chancellor of Germany, was also the period during which Röhm was doing his most consequential work, building the SA from 70,000 to the millions, while simultaneously managing the organization's role in the escalating street violence of those years. This violence was not incidental to the political dynamics of the period. It was central to them. The message that the SA's physical presence on the streets conveyed, that this movement was capable of organized, disciplined force on a scale that no other political actor could match, was part of what made conservative elites begin to seriously consider a Hitler chancellorship as a potentially manageable proposition. They were not wrong about the force. They were catastrophically wrong about the manageability. The role of conservative politicians, Franz von Papen above all, but also Alfred Hugenberg and a wider circle of nationalists who believed they could use Hitler for their own purposes, in the events of January 1933, has been extensively documented and analyzed. The short version is that they made a series of miscalculations of extraordinary magnitude, believing that Hitler's radicalism could be contained by coalition partners and constitutional constraints, and that the SA, which frightened them, would be brought to heel once the Nazi movement was in government, rather than in opposition. The longer version involves the specific dynamics of the constitutional crisis of late 1932 and early 1933, the role of Hindenburg's advisors, the failure of alternative governmental solutions, and the particular calculations of each of the major actors. Roehm watched these events from the inside, not as a major actor in the political negotiations that resulted in Hitler's chancellorship, but as the commander of the organization whose visible power and implied threat was one of the factors that shaped the calculations of everyone involved. The moment of Hitler's appointment as chancellor on the 30th of January, 1933, was experienced by the SA as a triumph. The culmination of the street battles, the marches, the rallies, the years of violence and organization and poverty and dedication that Roehm had channeled into the brown tide of the stormtroopers. The torchlight parade through the Brandenburg Gate that evening. Tens of thousands of SA men, SS men, and steel helmet veterans marching through Berlin in a display of organized political jubilation was, in one reading, Roehm's moment as much as Hitler's. The organization he had built was the visual representation of the movement's power, the physical demonstration that something had changed irreversibly in German politics. What he could not have known, or perhaps what he knew and refused to accept, was that this moment was also the beginning of the end of the SA's political relevance. The movement had won, and in winning, it no longer needed the same things from the SA that it had needed from it in the years of struggle. The value of a street fighting force in a country you already govern is considerably less than its value in a country you are fighting to take over. Roehm understood this intellectually. He resisted it politically. And that resistance was what brought him, 18 months later, to a prison cell in Stadelheim. The Weimar Republic formally ended, not with a bang, but with a series of procedural steps. The Enabling Act of March, 1933, which gave Hitler's government decree powers without parliamentary approval. The dissolution of the competing political parties over the following months. The bringing of the state governments under central control, the suppression of the trade unions. The beginning of the persecution of political opponents and of the Jewish population. Each of these steps was technically legal within the framework of the Weimar Constitution, which had not been designed to prevent its own destruction by a government that controlled a sufficient majority and was willing to use emergency powers. The SA participated in these transformations as an instrument of intimidation and violence. Men in SA uniform stood outside polling stations, occupied trade union offices, herded political prisoners into improvised detention facilities. This was the second revolution of a kind, but it was not the second revolution that Roehm had envisioned. It was a consolidation of power by the party and the state apparatus, not a transformation of German society along the military socialist lines that Roehm believed had been promised. And by the summer of 1933, as became clear that the Nazi government was pursuing stabilization rather than further revolution, Roehm's frustration was becoming visible to anyone who was paying attention, which, in the political world of the early Third Reich, was everyone. Chapter 10. The Anatomy of a Purge. The events of the 30th of June and the 1st and 2nd of July, 1934, are known in history as the Night of the Long Knives, a phrase taken from the lyrics of a Nazi marching song, which gives the episode its name, but also, inadvertently, captures something of its character. The application of organized, directed violence by men who had been trained in exactly that application and who carried out their orders with the methodical efficiency of people doing a job they had been prepared for. The historical analysis of this event has gone through several phases. In the immediate aftermath, the official Nazi framing, a suppressed coup, a justified act of state self-defense, was accepted by many foreign observers, and the speed with which the German legal establishment produced a post hoc legalization of the killings meant that the event was incorporated into the formal record of the German state as a legitimate exercise of executive power. The systematic scholarly deconstruction of this framing began after the Second World War and has continued to the present, with the consensus position being that there was no credible evidence of a planned SA coup, and that the purge was primarily a political elimination rather than a security operation. The mechanics of the operation are reasonably well documented, though there remain gaps and ambiguities in the record that reflect both the deliberate destruction of documents by the regime and the inherent difficulty of reconstructing events that were not meant to be transparently recorded. Goering managed the operation in Prussia and the northern regions, using the Gestapo and SS units under his authority. Himmler and Heydrich coordinated the SS operations in Bavaria and the southern regions. Hitler himself was present at Bad Wiessee for the arrest of Roehm and the other SA leaders there, which was a deliberate choice rather than an operational necessity. He was positioning himself as personally taking responsibility for the action, which was both a demonstration of will and a way of ensuring that the historical record would reflect his direct involvement, rather than allow him to claim later that he had been deceived by his subordinates. This was consistent with Hitler's broader political style. He generally preferred to be associated with decisive action and to bear visible personal responsibility for major decisions, even when those decisions involved the killing of former allies. The list of those killed extended well beyond the SA leadership. Among those who died in those 3 days were people who had been on Hitler's political enemies list for years. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher, who had attempted to outmaneuver Hitler in late 1932 and who Hitler had never forgiven. Gregor Strasser, the former Nazi mass organizer, who had broken with Hitler in December of 1932, and who represented the left populist tendency within the party that Roehm was associated with. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the Bavarian politician, who had backed away from the 1923 putsch at the critical moment and whom Hitler had been waiting to punish for over a decade. Edgar Jung, a conservative intellectual who had been working with Vice-Chancellor von Papen on speeches that were critical of Nazi excesses, and dozens of others whose deaths reflected old scores, current fears, or the ambitions of local SS commanders who used the confusion of the purge to eliminate private enemies under cover of the general operation. This opportunistic extension of the killing list beyond the original targets is one of the features of the purge that most clearly reveals its true nature. Not a carefully bounded security operation, but a moment of institutional license in which accumulated grievances were settled under the protection of official sanction. The international reaction to the Night of the Long Knives was, to a degree that is striking in retrospect, muted. The British and French governments were focused on the broader question of German foreign policy, and the military build-up that was already underway, and a purge of internal Nazi factions was regarded by some foreign analysts as potentially stabilizing. Evidence that the regime was moving toward greater normality and away from the radical disorder of its early months. The Times of London ran a leader describing Hitler as having shown himself to be a man of decision rather than a man of blood, a judgment that is remarkable not only for its inaccuracy, but for the degree to which it reflects the broader failure of European political establishments to understand what the Nazi state actually was. The legal murder of political opponents without trial, using a state security apparatus, with the subsequent post hoc legalization of the killings by a compliant parliament. These were not signs of normalization. They were the completion of the transformation of Germany into a state in which the rule of law had been replaced by the will of one man. But that completion was not visible in June of 1934 to people who were not looking for it. Within Germany, the reaction was similarly complex. There was genuine relief among conservative and military circles that the SA had been brought under control, a relief that expressed itself in the Reichswehr's willingness to swear the personal oath to Hitler on the 2nd of August, the day of Hindenburg's death. There was also private unease, even among committed Nazis, about the nature of what had happened. The killing of party comrades without trial, the obvious use of the purge to settle scores that had nothing to do with any SA coup, the spectacle of a government murdering its own internal opposition, and then legislating the murders as legal. Goebbels, whose diary from this period is one of the primary sources for the events themselves, records his own agitation and the relief that followed with a candor that suggests genuine emotion rather than purely calculated self-presentation. The permanent secretary of the Prussian Justice Ministry, who was responsible for formally processing some of the legal documentation around the killings, resigned his post in protest, a rare act of institutional resistance that is remembered by historians precisely because it was so rare. Most of those who knew what had happened and who were privately troubled by it said nothing, did nothing, and continued in their positions, adding one more brick to the wall of complicity that the Third Reich was building around the German governing class. The question of what Roehm's guilt actually amounted to. If the concept of guilt is applicable to someone killed without trial on the order of a dictator, is one that the historical sources allow to be addressed only partially. He had clearly talked about the Second Revolution in terms that went beyond rhetorical flourish. He had clearly built an organization that was, by any objective measure, capable of significant independent action. He had clearly expressed dissatisfaction with Hitler's direction to people who were not entirely trustworthy confidants. What he had not done, as far as the historical evidence allows us to assess, was take any concrete organizational steps toward the kind of coordinated assault on the state that the official justification for his killing required. The SA was not on alert. Its units were not in elevated readiness. Roehm himself was at a resort hotel on a prescribed holiday. Whatever the anxieties of the men who killed him, the evidence of an imminent coup is not in the record because most historians believe there was no imminent coup to record. The killing of Roehm was also the killing of a man who had, in the estimation of several contemporaries, a genuine loyalty to Hitler that was not simply transactional. The letters Roehm wrote to Hitler over the years, including letters from Bolivia that have survived in partial form in archives, express a personal attachment that reads as sincere rather than performative, the attachment of a man who had staked his reputation and his physical safety on a shared enterprise and who continued to believe, even as the enterprise moved in directions he did not fully support, that the relationship between them was a real one. Whether Hitler experienced anything comparable, whether the hesitation before ordering Roehm's death reflected anything more than political calculation is genuinely unknowable. What is knowable is that when the moment came, the political calculation overrode whatever personal feeling there was, as it had always overridden such feelings when the stakes were sufficiently high. Roehm had known this about Hitler. He had watched it happen to other people. He had perhaps simply not believed it would happen to him. That belief, that the comradeship of the early years, the bond of the front Kameradschaft, the mutual address in the familiar form, meant something that was not subject to political revision, was the last of his illusions, and the last to be destroyed. The physical circumstances of Roehm's death have been documented by the historians who investigated the events at Stadelheim prison in the weeks and months after the purge, drawing on the testimony of prison officials and SS personnel who were present. What the record shows is a man who maintained, in the final hours of his life, the military bearing that had been the consistent expression of his identity for 30 years. He did not plead. He did not recant. He refused the pistol that was brought to him, on the grounds that if his death had been ordered by Hitler, then Hitler should bear the full weight of that order, rather than being shielded from it by the convenience of a suicide. This refusal is the detail of the story that most human audiences find the hardest to set aside. Not because it redeems anything about the man or the movement he served, but because it is the kind of detail that insists on the full human reality of the person. And the story of Germany in these years has a persistent tendency to reduce everyone in it to their ideological function rather than their human complexity. Rome, at the end, was a human being who had made choices that were catastrophic in their consequences, and who died at 46 in a manner that his killers immediately set about misrepresenting to the world. Chapter 11. The world after Rome, the Germany that existed on the 2nd of August, 1934. The day President Hindenburg died, and the day the German armed forces swore their personal oath to Adolf Hitler, was a different country from the Germany that had existed 6 months earlier. And the difference was not only a matter of formal constitutional arrangement. The Night of the Long Knives had demonstrated, for anyone who was watching carefully, that the Nazi state operated by a logic that no constitutional framework could contain or predict, that its internal conflicts were resolved by killing rather than by deliberation, and that the law was an instrument of power rather than a constraint on it. The men who swore the oath to Hitler on that August morning knew this, at least implicitly. The oath itself, sworn personally to a named individual rather than to an office or a constitution, reflected and reinforced this logic. It bound the military to a man, not to a state, and the consequences of that binding would become apparent in the years ahead. The SS, which had been the instrument of the purge, emerged from the Night of the Long Knives in a position of dramatically enhanced institutional power. Within weeks of the purge, Himmler's organization was formally elevated to independent status, no longer nominally subordinate to the SA, but a fully autonomous organization reporting directly to Hitler. The resources, personnel, and facilities that had previously belonged to the SA were gradually transferred or absorbed. The intelligence apparatus that Heydrich had built was expanded and given new responsibilities. The concentration camp system, which had originated in the chaos of early 1933 as improvised facilities for political prisoners, was taken over by the SS and reorganized into a more systematic structure under Theodor Eicke, the same man who had brought the pistol to Roehm's cell and who was given command of the camp system as his reward for the role he had played in the purge. The connections between the events of June and July 1934 and the subsequent development of the machinery of systematic persecution are direct and documented, which is one reason why historians of the Holocaust regard the Night of the Long Knives as a significant step in the evolution of the Nazi state, rather than simply an internal power struggle. The relationship between the Röhm Purge and the subsequent persecution of gay men in Nazi Germany is a subject that requires careful handling, because it involves the intersection of political calculation, ideological conviction, and the use of a group's vulnerability as a tool for other purposes. The official justification for the purge had included a public denunciation of the homosexuality within the SA leadership, not because Röhm's sexuality was the real reason for his murder, but because it was useful in the public presentation of the case. This public denunciation had the effect of signaling that the regime's attitude toward homosexuality had shifted from the tactical indifference of the early years to something considerably more hostile. Paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code, which had criminalized male homosexuality since the founding of the empire, was strengthened by amendment in June of 1935. Almost exactly 1 year after the purge, and the number of prosecutions under the law increased dramatically in the years that followed. The connection between the public politics of the purge and the subsequent legal and social crackdown is not a matter of proven direct causation, but of historical pattern. The public targeting of homosexuality as a mark of the SA's corruption created conditions in which the persecution of gay men could be intensified without significant political resistance. The conservative political establishment, the aristocrats and generals and industrialists who had believed they were using Hitler rather than being used by him, found themselves, after the summer of 1934, in a position that had narrowed considerably since January of 1933. The purge had demonstrated that Hitler was willing to use lethal force against allies who became inconvenient, and the personal oath had removed the one institutional counterweight, the military, that might otherwise have provided the basis for a challenge to his authority. Some of these men drew conclusions from the events of June and July that led them, eventually, toward the various resistance movements that sought to remove Hitler by force. Movements that would culminate in the assassination attempt of the 20th of July, 1944. Others drew the opposite conclusion, that the man who had just demonstrated his willingness and ability to kill his enemies was precisely the kind of strong leadership that Germany needed, and that the SA's suppression proved that the regime was normalizing rather than radicalizing. Both readings of the same events led to opposite political conclusions, and the history of the subsequent decade is partly the history of which reading turned out to be correct, which was, as the record makes clear, neither of them in the ways their proponents had anticipated. The international situation in the summer of 1934 was in one of those intervals of apparent stability that retrospect reveals as the pause between one period of crisis and the next. The rearmament of Germany was proceeding, still partially under the cover of civilian programs, but the direction was clear to anyone examining the available evidence, and some foreign intelligence services were examining it with considerable attention. The purge had, paradoxically, improved Hitler's standing with some foreign governments by seeming to demonstrate that the more radical elements of the Nazi movement had been brought under control. This misreading of the purge as the victory of the moderate wing over the radical wing of National Socialism, rather than as the completion of Hitler's personal dictatorship, was shared by a significant number of foreign policy analysts in the mid-1930s, and it contributed to the broader climate of wishful thinking about German intentions that would make the response to subsequent German actions consistently slower and weaker than it needed to be. In Munich, where the Night of the Long Knives had been operationally centered, the immediate aftermath was experienced with a mixture of shock, relief, and the particular cognitive dissonance of people who had witnessed something they did not know how to process. The city that had been the birthplace of the Nazi movement, where Roehm had first met Hitler in 1919, and where the Putsch of 1923 had begun and ended, was now the city in which that movement had killed several dozen of its own members, including its second most powerful figure of the preceding decade. The bars and beer halls, where stormtroopers had gathered for 15 years, were quieter that summer. The brown uniforms were still visible, but something had changed in the bearing of the men who wore them. A caution, a wariness, a new awareness that the organization they had joined was capable of turning on its own members without warning or recourse. This awareness did not dissolve the SA, but it transformed it in ways that Roehm, had he lived, would have found unrecognizable. The German public's reaction to the purge, as far as it can be reconstructed from the available sources, which are necessarily incomplete given the regime's control of communications, appears to have been broadly positive, or at least not significantly negative, in the short term. This is one of the genuinely disturbing findings of the historical record, and one that has generated substantial scholarly discussion about the nature of public opinion in authoritarian states, and the degree to which the apparent approval of the German public for events like the Purge reflects genuine sentiment, or the systematic absence of any channel through which dissent could be expressed. Reports from social democratic informants who were monitoring public opinion in Germany for the party leadership in exiles suggest that many Germans welcomed the reduction of the SA's power, which had made daily life in many parts of the country genuinely threatening, and accept the official narrative of a suppressed coup without significant skepticism. The fact that dozens of people had been murdered without trial did not appear, from these reports, to be a central concern for a public that had been saturated for years with the message that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. Chapter 12. The man behind the myth there is, in almost every account of Ernst Roehm that has been written since his death, a tendency toward one of two reductive conclusions. Either he is presented primarily as a thug, a violent man of limited political intelligence, whose contribution to the Nazi movement was essentially muscular rather than intellectual, whose sexuality is mentioned as a detail of biographical color, and whose death is treated as the natural end of someone who played with fire. Or he is presented as a tragic figure, a true believer who was betrayed by the revolution he helped make, a man whose vision of a genuine social revolution was suppressed in favor of a conservative counter-revolution dressed in Nazi clothing. Both of these framings have elements of truth in them, and both are insufficient as complete accounts of a complex human being operating in extraordinarily complex historical circumstances. The task of this chapter is not to choose between them, but to look at the man who existed in the space between these two simplified versions, and to ask what we can actually know about him. Not as a symbol or a function, but as a person. The physical reality of Roehm's life is, in some respects, the easiest place to start, because it is the most directly documented. He was a man who lived in his body in a way that many political figures do not, shaped by the physical experiences of 3 wars' worth of wounds, by the physical demands of military training and leadership, by the physical culture of the SA, with its marching and its drilling and its street confrontations. The scar tissue on his face was not merely cosmetic. It was the record of a life that had been tested in specific physical ways, and his bearing, compact, confident, slightly aggressive in the directness of his gaze, and the firmness of his handshake, was the product of 30 years of living in environments where physical authority communicated something that words could not. People who met him and who have left accounts of those meetings consistently note this physical quality, not necessarily threatening, but unambiguously present in a way that made him difficult to ignore or dismiss. He was, in the contemporary photographic record, a man who looked exactly like what he was, which is a rarer quality in politicians than it is in soldiers. His friendships, as far as they can be reconstructed from letters and memoirs, were genuine and durable in the way that friendships formed in extreme circumstances tend to be. He maintained contact with former comrades from the First World War and the Freikorps, years across decades, writing letters that were personal rather than political, asking about families and health, and the small details of lives that the grand narratives of history always overlook. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him well, a man of considerable personal loyalty, not the performance of loyalty that political life requires, but something more privately felt, more easily extended to individuals than to institutions. This quality made his betrayal by Hitler, by the man he had addressed in the familiar form to whom he had given the best 15 years of his political life, something that many of those who knew him believed he genuinely could not believe, even at the end. His refusal to accept the pistol in the prison cell can be read as many things: defiance, pride, last assertion of the military code that required a soldier to face his fate standing rather than taking his own life. It can also be read as the action of a man who genuinely could not accept that the relationship was what it had turned out to be. The question of Roehm's relationship to the broader human suffering caused by the movement he served, the persecution of political opponents, the beginning of the systematic targeting of Jewish Germans, the violence of the SA in the streets of the Weimar Republic, is one that cannot be evaded in any honest account of his life, and it is a question that his admirers, such as they were, generally evaded. He was not a bystander. He was not an unwilling participant. He built the organization that was one of the primary instruments of that violence, recruited and trained the men who carried it out, and commanded the structure within which it was organized and directed. Whether he gave specific orders for specific acts of violence in specific places is a question the records do not fully resolve. Whether he was responsible for the violence done by the organization he commanded is not a question that requires that level of documentary precision. He was responsible. The historical record is clear on that point, and intellectual honesty requires stating it plainly. At the same time, the full picture requires acknowledging that Roehm's position on the question of Jewish persecution was more complicated, or at least less clearly documented, than those of the movement's most ideologically committed anti-Semites. This is not an exoneration. It is a historical observation. The violence that the SA directed against Jewish Germans in the early 1930s, the intimidation of businesses, the physical attacks on individuals, the organized disruption of Jewish community life, was conducted under Roehm's command. The distinction between commanding such violence and directing it from personal conviction may be meaningful in a psychological or biographical sense, while being entirely without significance in a moral or historical sense. The people who were attacked or intimidated by SA men were attacked and intimidated regardless of the precise emotional state of the man at the top of the command structure. This is the part of Rome's story that the most sympathetic biographical accounts have the most difficulty integrating, and it is the part that any honest account must sit with, rather than resolve. The letters that became public in 1932. The letters that revealed in explicit terms Rome's sexuality, and that the Social Democrats used in their pamphlet campaign, are among the more remarkable documents in the entire historical record of the early Nazi period, not for their content, but for what the public reaction to them reveals about the political culture of Weimar Germany. The letters were real. Their content was not seriously disputed. They were distributed to hundreds of thousands of addresses, and the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler successfully weathered the scandal, not by denying the content of the letters, but by dismissing the political relevance of a man's private life, by attacking the Social Democrats for playing dirty politics, and by relying on the calculation that the SA's mass membership cared more about what Roehm represented to them than about what the letters revealed. That calculation was correct, at least in the short term. It reveals something important about the nature of the SA's internal culture, that the masculine solidarity Roehm had built was not disrupted by the revelation of his sexuality in the way that his enemies had hoped, because the men who followed him were following something that his sexuality was not the foundation of. Whatever one makes of the irony of that, and the ironies are considerable, it is historically significant. The historiography of Rome has evolved substantially since the 1960s, when serious academic history of the early Nazi period began to accumulate in ways that allowed for more nuanced analysis than the immediate post-war generation could produce. The early accounts, written close to events, often by people who had been directly involved or directly affected, tended toward either demonization or, in some cases, a degree of retrospective sympathy for the radical wing of Nazism as a genuine alternative to the direction the regime took. Later historians, particularly those working in the 1980s and 1990s, with access to a wider range of archival material, produced more carefully bounded accounts that were less willing to treat Rome's radicalism as a meaningful alternative and more focused on the specific historical context in which he operated. The most recent generation of scholarship has been interested in the social history of the SA as an institution, in the experience of the men who served in it, rather than only in the decisions of the men who led it. And this focus has produced a richer, messier, and more honest picture of what the SA actually was than either the demonizing or the sympathetic accounts could achieve. The memoirs of the period, Speer's account, the various diaries and letters that have survived, consistently return to Rome as one of the figures whose memory provokes a particular kind of discomfort, the discomfort of someone who was genuinely present at the beginning of something and who understood that beginning in terms that the people around him either never shared or eventually abandoned. Speer, who knew Röhm slightly and observed him in the social milieu of the Nazi leadership, described him as someone who seemed to inhabit a different political world from the others around him, less focused on the external presentation of power, more absorbed in the internal life of the organization he had built, less interested in the trappings of the state, and more interested in the reality of the military community. This description, if accurate, captures something essential about why Rome was ultimately incompatible with the regime he had helped create. The Third Reich, as it evolved after January of 1933, was above all a state, with all the bureaucratic, institutional, diplomatic, and ceremonial apparatus that states require. Rome had never been interested in states. He was interested in armies. And the distinction in the political world of the Third Reich turned out to be fatal. The legacy of Ernst Roehm cannot be separated from the legacy of the movement he served, and the legacy of that movement is catastrophic in ways that context cannot mitigate. He helped build the political vehicle that delivered Germany into the hands of a regime that would, within 11 years of his death, leave more than 60 million people dead across Europe and Asia. That would organize the industrialized murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others. And that would end in the physical destruction of the country he had spent his life claiming to love. His contribution to the specific horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust was indirect. He was dead 6 years before the war began. But it was real, in the sense that the movement he helped make powerful was the movement that carried those horrors out. These are facts. They do not admit of comfortable narrative resolution. They require being stated clearly and without embellishment as the frame within which any account of his life must be understood. And yet the history of this specific man, the soldier's son from Munich, the 3 times wounded captain of the First World War, the Freikorps Organizers and weapons cache keeper, the builder of a 4.5 million member paramilitary force, the man who died in a prison cell refusing a pistol on a Sunday morning in July, that history is not only the history of his political function, it is also the history of a human life lived in full, with conviction and contradiction, with genuine loyalty and genuine violence, with a vision of Germany that was wrong in most of the ways that matter, and yet was also specifically his, arrived at through specific experience, held with specific intensity, and destroyed not by the enemies he had faced in the streets of Weimar Germany, but by the man he had helped make the most powerful figure in Europe. There is something in that final fact, not redemptive, not exculpatory, simply human, that insists on being acknowledged. History is made by people. Even the worst of them were people first. Chapter 13. The S, the Earth. There is a specific kind of institutional transformation that only becomes fully visible in retrospect. The kind where an organization that appeared, at one moment, to be a secondary instrument of a larger power emerges. A few months later, as the dominant force in an entirely reorganized landscape. The SS's transformation after the Night of the Long Knives was that kind of change for most of the years between its founding in 1925 and the summer of 1934. The Schutzstaffel had been formally subordinate to the SA, a smaller, more elite bodyguard unit that reported up through the same chain of command that Rome commanded. It had a distinctive black uniform and a reputation for ideological rigor that set it apart from the more rough and ready culture of the brown-shirted stormtroopers. But in terms of size, resources, and political weight, it was a secondary organization inside a larger one. The events of late June and early July 1934 changed that relationship permanently and completely with a speed that was possible only because the groundwork had been laid so carefully over so many months by men who understood precisely what they were doing. Heinrich Himmler, who held the title of Reichsführer SS, was one of the more genuinely unusual figures in the Nazi leadership. Not in the sense of being moderate or complex in ways that complicated the ideological picture, but in the sense that his particular brand of conviction and his particular organizational methodology produced results that were different in kind from those produced by the more conventionally brutal figures around him. He was meticulous in a way that Goering was not, systematic in a way that Rome was not, and ideologically committed at a cellular level in a way that even some of his closest colleagues found successive. He believed with complete sincerity in a racial mythology that most educated Germans of his generation privately regarded as eccentric. He maintained extensive dossiers on everyone of significance in the regime, including his own allies. He built organizations within organizations, creating layers of surveillance and accountability that was simultaneously a genuine administrative achievement and an instrument of control that served his own institutional interests as much as those of the state. After the purge, these qualities placed him in a position that the more glamorous, more conventionally political figures around him could not easily challenge. The formal elevation of the SS to independent organizational status, no longer subordinate to the SA, but reporting directly to Hitler, came in the weeks immediately following the purge, and it was the administrative expression of a political reality that the purge itself had created. The SS had carried out the killings. The SS had demonstrated, in the most concrete possible terms, its absolute loyalty to Hitler's personal authority. The reward for this demonstration was the institutional independence that Himmler had been building toward for years, and that the SA's existence had previously blocked. By the autumn of 1934, the SS was expanding into domains that the SA had previously occupied. The concentration camp system, the intelligence apparatus through Heydrich's security service, the policing functions in various German states, and was doing so with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything Himmler touched. The SA continued to exist, with Victor Lutze appointed as its new leader after Rohm's murder. But Lutze was not Roehm. He was a functionary rather than a builder, a man who managed the organization's decline with institutional competence while making no serious attempt to recover what had been lost. Under Lutze, the SA became exactly what Hitler had always said it should be: subordinate, predictable, and safe. The concentration camp system that the SS inherited and reorganized after the summer of 1934 had begun in March of 1933, in the first weeks of the Nazi government, as a collection of improvised facilities for the detention of political opponents. Communist Party, officials, social democratic leaders, trade union organizers, journalists, lawyers, and others whose opposition to the regime was considered dangerous. These early facilities were chaotic, decentralized, and operated by a mixture of SA units and state police forces, with varying levels of organization and supervision. Under Theodor Eicke, who had been appointed commandant of the first concentration camp at Dachau in June of 1933, and who was elevated to inspector of concentration camps after the purge as his reward for shooting Röhm. The system was reorganized along explicitly military lines with standardized regulations, a defined hierarchy of command, and a specific institutional culture designed to brutalize guards as well as prisoners in ways that made ordinary human compassion not merely discouraged, but structurally impossible. The camp system that emerged from this reorganization between 1934 and 1939 was not the same thing as the later genocide, but it was the institutional ancestor of it, and Eich's role in its creation, and his direct connection to Röhm's death, is one of those historical threads that historians of the Holocaust have traced with careful attention. The relationship between the SS's rise and the broader development of what historians sometimes call the racial state. The systematic application of racial ideology to the governance of Germany is direct and well documented. It was Himmler's SS that administered the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935, which stripped Jewish Germans of citizenship and prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jewish and non-Jewish Germans. It was Himmler's organization that oversaw the accelerating persecution of Jewish life throughout the 1930s. The professional exclusions, the property confiscations, the forced emigration programs, and, ultimately, the violence of the November pogroms of 1938, in which the SA played a significant role as well. The SS did not replace the SSA as an instrument of anti-Semitic terror. Both organizations participated in the persecution of Jewish Germans throughout the decade. But the SS provided the bureaucratic and ideological framework within which that persecution was organized and escalated, while the SA provided the street-level mass violence that gave the persecution its most visible face. Understanding that both organizations were active simultaneously and that the purge of 1934 had reorganized rather than reduced the regime's capacity for organized violence is essential to understanding the history of this period. The expansion of Himmler's empire beyond the borders of Germany was one of the more significant developments of the late 1930s, and it accelerated rapidly after the occupation of Austria in March of 1938, and the subsequent annexations and occupations that followed. The SS was involved in the administration of occupied territories in ways that made it the dominant institutional force in the Nazi Empire, outside Germany proper, running the civil administration in some occupied territories, controlling the security apparatus in others, and, beginning in 1941, organizing the mass murder operations in the occupied Soviet territories that marked the transition to the final solution. None of this was inevitable in 1934, but the institutional conditions that made it possible, the SS's independence, its direct access to Hitler, its control of the security and intelligence apparatus, and above all its culture of unconditional loyalty to ideological commands, regardless of legal or moral constraints, were all established in the weeks and months following Roehm's death. The Night of the Long Knives was not the beginning of the Holocaust, but it was the moment at which the organization that would carry out the Holocaust became the dominant security institution of the German state. Personal trajectory of Himmler himself, from the relatively minor figure of the mid-1920s to the second most powerful man in the German state by the early 1940s, is inseparable from the story of Roehm's destruction. Without the purge, the SS would have remained institutionally constrained by its nominal subordination to the SA, and Himmler's expansion would have required either confronting Roehm directly or waiting for circumstances to change. The purge provided circumstances that changed overnight, and Himmler used those circumstances with the opportunistic efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this kind of opening for years. Whether he anticipated the specific events of June and July 1934, or simply recognized them as the opportunity they were when they arrived, is a question the sources do not fully resolve. What is clear is that he was not a passive beneficiary. He was an active architect of the conditions that made the purge possible, and an active executor of the purge itself, and the institutional rewards he collected in its aftermath were the direct result of choices he had made and risks he had taken. The relationship between the two men's stories, Roehm and Himmler, the builder and his successor, is one of the darker ironies of a period that is full of dark ironies. The SS, by the late 1930s, was no longer simply a security organization. It had become something more unusual, a state within a state, with its own economic enterprises, its own demographic research programs, its own agricultural settlements, its own schools and training facilities, its own mythology and ritual life, and its own vision of what Germany was and should become. Himmler's ambitions for the SS extended well beyond policing or even warfare. He envisioned it as the racial elite of the new Germany, the breeding stock of a future German civilization, the institutional embodiment of everything the Nazi ideology said about racial hierarchy and the destiny of the Germanic people. This vision was grandiose in ways that even some of his colleagues found extraordinary, and its practical expression in various resettlement, eugenics, and population programs produced specific human suffering on a scale that the documentary record preserves in detail, that is often very difficult to read. The man who arrived at this position of almost unlimited institutional power did so by helping to murder Ernst Roehm. That chain of causation is historical fact, not rhetoric, and it is one of the reasons why the story of Roehm's death matters beyond the personal tragedy of the man himself. Chapter 14. The Saar after the storm. The 4.5 million men who had constituted the SA at the peak of Rome. S Command did not disappear after the Night of the Long Knives. They were still there, in their uniforms, in their local units, in the communities where they had drilled and marched and gathered for years. What had disappeared was the thing that had given the organization its particular energy and direction, the sense of being a revolutionary force in motion, the belief that the SA was building towards something transformative, rather than simply maintaining a presence in the landscape of the Third Reich. Victor Lutze, who replaced Roehm as Chief of Staff, was selected precisely because he was unlikely to recreate what Roehm had built. He was a loyal party man, competent in the administrative sense, politically unthreatening, and entirely without the magnetic quality that had made Roehm capable of inspiring mass loyalty from men who would otherwise have had little reason to follow anyone. Under Lutze, the SA shrank, not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily and continuously through the late 1930s, as men found their way into other organizations, or simply drifted away from an institution that no longer offered the sense of purpose it once had. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the organization that had numbered 4.5 million at its peak had contracted to something between 1 and 2 million, with significant regional variations and a general reduction in the intensity of members' engagement. The question of what the surviving SA men made of the purge, how they understood the killing of their commander and dozens of their senior colleagues, what it meant to them about the nature of the movement they had joined, is one that the historical record addresses only partially because the conditions of the Third Reich made honest expression of that kind of feeling both dangerous and largely invisible. The regime's official narrative was that Rome had been a traitor, a pervert, and a plotter against the state, and that the purge had been an act of necessary self-defense by a government facing genuine threat. Most SA men were not in a position to challenge this narrative publicly, and many of them, having absorbed the SA's culture of unconditional loyalty to Hitler as a personal leader, rather than to any institutional structure, appear to have accepted it at some level, or at least accepted the necessity of acting as if they accepted it, which in practice amounts to the same thing. The historians who have interviewed survivors or worked with the personal letters and diaries of the period have found a range of responses. from genuine relief at the reduction of tension that had been building through 1933 and early 1934, to private grief for specific comrades who had died, to a persistent cognitive dissonance in men who found themselves serving loyally in an organization whose leadership had been murdered by the state they were supposed to be defending. The SA's role in the November pogroms of 1938. The events known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, is the most significant episode in the organization's post-Rome history, and it is a history that requires careful treatment. The pogroms of the 9th and 10th of November were not spontaneous. They were organized and directed by the party and SS leadership, following the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish man, and they involved coordinated attacks on Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes across Germany and Austria. SA units played a prominent role in the physical violence of those nights, smashing windows, setting fires, attacking individuals, and participating in the arrest and transportation of tens of thousands of Jewish men to concentration camps. This was not, in organizational terms, a revival of the SA's pre-purge power. It was the SA being used as an instrument of directed state violence, exactly as Hitler had always said the organization should be used. Subordinate to political command, deployed for specific operational purposes, and then stood down when those purposes had been served. The men who participated were the same men Roehm had recruited and organized. They were doing, in a more extreme form, what the SA had been doing since the early 1920s. But they were doing it now as instruments of a fully consolidated state apparatus, rather than as a revolutionary force with its own political agency. The social history of the individual SA, men in the years between the purge and the outbreak of war, is a subject that mainstream histories of the Third Reich often compress into a few sentences. The SA faded, the SS rose, the story moves on. But the individual trajectories of the millions of men who passed through the SA are part of the human texture of the period in ways that matter for understanding how a society could move from street-level paramilitary violence to industrialized mass murder over the course of less than a decade. Many SA veterans moved into the Wehrmacht when war came and served in the German military campaigns of the war, years with the same disciplined ferocity that they had brought to the street battles of the Weimar period. Others moved into civilian party administration, police functions, or the various state institutions that the Third Reich had built. A smaller but significant number moved into the SS and the apparatus of occupation, administration that would, in the occupied Eastern territories, be directly involved in mass killing operations. The continuity of personnel between the SA of the Weimar period and the various institutional forms of Nazi violence in the war years has been documented by several historians and remains an important thread in the broader historiographical project of understanding how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary violence. The SA's formal history continued, in diminished form, through the war years. From 1939 onward, its primary official function was the pre-military training of men who would eventually be conscripted into the Wehrmacht, a role that was both practically useful to the war effort and symbolically appropriate in the sense that it made the SA exactly what Hitler had always said it should be: a training ground for conventional military service, rather than an independent military force with its own political ambitions. Victor Lutzer held the position of Chief of Staff until his death in a traffic accident in May of 1943. A death that, given the era and the organization, some contemporaries treated with private skepticism, though the historical consensus is that it was genuinely accidental. He was succeeded by Wilhelm Scheppmann, who held the position until the end of the war, and who presided over an organization that was, by the final years of the conflict, barely distinguishable from a minor administrative appendage of the military mobilization apparatus. The SA was formally dissolved in 1945, along with all other Nazi organizations, as part of the Allied occupation and denazification process. It ended not with the dramatic confrontation that Roehm had always anticipated and sometimes seemed to court, but with the administrative dissolution of an organization that had long since ceased to be what its most consequential leader had made it. The men who had built the SA in the years when it mattered, the unit commanders, the regional leaders, the thousands of officers who had given the organization its particular character under Roehm's direction, experienced the post-purge world in ways that varied enormously depending on who they were and what they had done. Those who had been too closely identified with Roma personally, or who had been too vocal about the Second Revolution and its promises, found themselves in various states of marginalization. Some dismissed from their positions, some sent to concentration camps, some simply watched and warned and allowed to continue in diminished roles. Those who had been more politically flexible, or who had been sufficiently junior that their specific views and loyalties had not been noted at the senior levels, generally continued in party or state positions without significant disruption. The purge had been aimed specifically at the senior leadership and those associated with Rome's inner circle. It had not attempted to purge the mass membership of the SA, and the mass membership, the hundreds of thousands of ordinary men who had joined the organization for the range of reasons that brought ordinary men to extraordinary organizations, largely continued in the political and social roles available to them in the Third Reich, under different auspices, and with the lesson firmly understood that the price of the wrong kind of loyalty was a cell in Stadelheim prison. The physical infrastructure of the SA, its barracks, training grounds, administrative buildings, and equipment, was absorbed into the expanding state apparatus with the characteristic efficiency of an authoritarian system that wastes nothing that can be redirected. Barracks became SS facilities or party training centers. Training grounds were incorporated into Wehrmacht preparation programs. Administrative offices were folded into regional party structures. The brown uniform, the most visible symbol of the SA's identity, continued to be worn at party events and rallies throughout the period, providing a visual continuity that obscured the fundamental change in the organization's nature and status. This visual continuity served a specific political purpose. It prevented the obvious question, what happened to the SA, from being too readily asked in public spaces where the answer would have been inconvenient. In the carefully managed visual culture of the Third Reich, the presence of brown uniforms at rallies communicated a continuity of the movement's core institutions that was, in institutional reality, entirely misleading. Roehm had understood that visual culture was political communication. The regime understood this too, and it used that understanding to manage the memory of what the purge had done to the organization he had built. Chapter 15, Germany. At War, the Shadow of 1934. The road from the summer of 1934 to the 1st of September 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland and began the Second World War, was 5 years of escalating consolidation, accelerating rearmament, diplomatic audacity, and a string of territorial acquisitions that dismantled the post-war European order piece by piece, while the governments of France and Britain alternated between protest and accommodation with a consistency that, in retrospect, amounts to one of the most consequential failures of statecraft in modern history. The events of the Night of the Long Knives were, at one level, simply the backstory to all of this, the internal settling of accounts that preceded the external expansion. But the connection between the purge and the war is not merely chronological. The purge created the conditions that made the war possible in specific ways that historians have traced with considerable care, and understanding those connections is part of understanding the full weight of what happened in those 3 days. In late June and early July 1934, the Army's personal oath to Hitler, sworn on the 2nd of August 1934, was the most direct institutional consequence of the purge, and its implications took years to fully manifest. In the short term, the oath seemed to represent a stabilization, the dangerous uncertainty of the preceding 18 months, during which the SA's ambitions had made the relationship between the Nazi movement and the professional military genuinely volatile, had been resolved in favor of the military's preferred outcome. The SA had been cut down. The Army retained its professional independence, its officer corps, its institutional traditions. In exchange, it had given Hitler something that no constitutional arrangement and no formal grant of authority could have provided: the personal loyalty of every serving officer and every soldier in Germany, bound by a solemn oath sworn in the tradition of the German military to the individual named Adolf Hitler, rather than to the state or the constitution or the German people. This was what the generals thought they were getting in exchange for their acquiescence in the purge. What they actually got was the mechanism of their own eventual subordination to a leadership that would take them into catastrophe, and the oath that would make it nearly impossible to organize internal resistance without the burden of its violation. The rearmament of Germany, which proceeded through the mid-1930s with a speed that alarmed neighboring countries and occupied the attention of foreign intelligence services, was made possible by the political consolidation that the purge had completed. Before January of 1933, German rearmament was constrained by the terms of Versailles and by the political instability of Weimar, governments that could not agree on a consistent program. After January of 1933, it was constrained by the need to maintain the appearance of compliance, while building the military-industrial capacity that full-scale rearmament required. After the purge and the assumption of the combined presidency and chancellorship in August of 1934, it was constrained by almost nothing except the practical limits of industrial capacity and the time required to train an officer corps and a fighting force capable of the campaigns that Hitler was planning. The conscript army that was publicly announced in March of 1935, in open violation of the Versailles terms, to which France and Britain responded with formal protests that led to no practical consequences, was built on foundations that the years of semi-covert rearmament under Weimar and the early Nazi period had laid. By 1939, Germany had an army, an air force, and a navy that were, in specific technical and operational domains, the most capable fighting forces in Europe. The question of whether Rome's survival would have changed this trajectory is one that historians approach with appropriate caution, because counterfactual history of this kind is genuinely speculative, and the variables involved are too numerous and too complex. For confident prediction, what can be said is that Rome's vision of German military power, a mass revolutionary army, organized along ideological lines, replacing the professional officer corps, was different in important ways from the army that actually fought the Second World War, and that the differences were not trivial. The Wehrmacht that invaded Poland, France, and the Soviet Union was a professional force built on the institutional traditions and technical competence of the Reichswehr, supplemented by the rapid expansion of conscription and the incorporation of new operational concepts like blitzkrieg that the professional officer corps had developed. A Rome-style people's army, had it actually been built, would have been a different instrument with different strengths and weaknesses. Whether it would have been more or less militarily effective in the specific campaigns that defined the Second World War is genuinely unclear. Whether the political conditions under which such an army would have operated, a Germany in which Rome's Second Revolution had succeeded, and the conservative establishment had been displaced by a more radical and economically egalitarian nationalism, would have led to the same war is an even more open question. These are the kinds of questions that historians ask, not because they can be answered, but because the asking of them forces a more precise understanding of what the actual history was. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, was the central event of the Second World War. From the perspective of its victims, and one of the central questions in the historiography of the Nazi state from the perspective of scholars trying to understand how it happened. The Purge of 1934 did not cause the Holocaust. The ideological prerequisites for the Holocaust, the virulent anti-Semitism of the Nazi movement, the racial hierarchy embedded in Nazi ideology, the dehumanization of Jewish people that had been a feature of Nazi rhetoric since the movement's earliest days, were present before the Purge and were shared by virtually every figure in the Nazi leadership, including Rome. What the Purge did was consolidate the institutional conditions under which the Holocaust became organizationally possible. The SS's dominance of the security and policing apparatus, the army's personal binding to Hitler's authority, the elimination of the one major internal political force that had a sufficiently different agenda that its continued presence might have complicated the regime's trajectory. None of these conditional factors are presented here as moral mitigations of the Holocaust, or as arguments that a different outcome was likely. They are presented as historical connections that deserve to be stated clearly, rather than compressed into the conventional narrative of the Purge as simply an internal Nazi power struggle. The foreign policy of Germany between 1934 and 1939, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March of 1936, the annexation of Austria in March of 1938, the absorption of the Sudetenland in October of 1938, following the Munich Agreement, and the occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, was conducted by a Hitler whose domestic political authority was, after the summer of 1934, essentially unlimited. There was no Rome, no SA Leadership Council, no powerful internal faction capable of challenging the direction of policy or forcing reconsideration of decisions that the military professionals around Hitler privately doubted. The generals who opposed specific operations, those who feared that the Rhineland operation would trigger French military intervention, those who believed the Czechoslovakia crisis risked a premature war with Britain and France, expressed their concerns through internal memoranda and private conversations, rather than through any institutional mechanism that could have compelled Hitler to take those concerns seriously. The Oath of August 1934 bound them to the man, rather than to a constitutional process, and when the man overrode their advice and turned out to be right, as he was, tactically, in the series of bloodless acquisitions between 1936 and 1939. The credibility of professional military judgment was further eroded in ways that made the subsequent resistance to his decisions in the actual war years even harder to mount. The German public in these years experienced a country that was, by a number of measures, doing well. Unemployment had fallen dramatically from the catastrophic levels of the early 1930s. The economy was producing again, the territorial acquisitions were popular, and the humiliations of Versailles were being visibly reversed. The mood of the mid-1930s in Germany is one of those historical phenomena that observers from outside Germany at the time and historians afterward have struggled to integrate with the simultaneous reality of the persecution of Jewish Germans, the destruction of trade unions, the imprisonment of political opponents, and the growing apparatus of surveillance and terror that characterized daily life in ways that were not equally visible to all members of society. These realities coexisted, and their coexistence is part of the historical record rather than a paradox that needs to be explained away. The men who had been SA members and who were now living in the stabilized, economically recovering Germany of the mid-1930s were part of this complex picture, beneficiaries in some respects of the economic recovery, participants in varying degrees in the persecution of their neighbors, and living under a political authority that had demonstrated, in the summer of 1934, its willingness to kill its own most powerful members when they became inconvenient. The lesson had been learned broadly and deeply. The question of what lessons remained to be learned was one that the next 10 years would answer with devastating thoroughness. Chapter 16: Remembering and Forgetting. The process by which a historical event is remembered and the process by which it is forgotten are not opposites. They are related activities that happen simultaneously in the same society, often carried out by the same people for different purposes, and the record they leave behind is always a palimpsest. Layers of official narrative, private recollection, institutional documentation, and retrospective interpretation, each written over the others, in ways that require careful reading to separate. The memory of Ernst Roehm and the Night of the Long Knives passed through several distinct phases of public treatment in the decades following the events themselves, and tracing those phases is part of understanding not only what happened, but what the people who came after made of what happened, which is, in its own way, equally revealing about the nature of the society that produced these events in the first place. In the immediate aftermath of the purge, the Nazi regime's management of the memory of what had occurred was swift, comprehensive, and largely successful in controlling the public narrative within Germany. The official account, coup plot, necessary state self-defense, moral corruption of the SA leadership, was disseminated through the controlled press and amplified by Goebbels' propaganda apparatus with the full force of a state media system that had no effective competition. Rome's name was removed from the honorifics and commemorations that had been attached to it. Streets and squares that had been named after him in the years of the movement's rise were quietly renamed. His memoir, Geschichte eines Hofverräters, was withdrawn from circulation, and the copies that remained in private hands were kept there, rather than displayed. The people who had known him personally, and who were still alive, were distributed across the spectrum of the Third Reich. Some in positions that required their continued usefulness to the regime, some in varying states of marginalization, and some in camps or prisons, and none of them were in a position to offer public corrections to the official narrative. Within Germany, by the late 1930s, the story of Rome as traitor and moral degenerate was the only story available in official public discourse. Outside Germany, the picture was more complex and more interesting. The foreign press of 1934 had covered the purge with a combination of shock, confusion, and the kind of retrospective rationalization that tends to occur when journalists and analysts are confronted with events that don't fit comfortably into their existing frameworks. Some foreign commentators, as noted in the previous chapter, had accepted the official Nazi explanation at a level of credulity that is striking in retrospect. Others had been more skeptical from the beginning, reporters with direct experience of German politics who understood the difference between a suppressed coup and a political execution, and who said so in terms that were as direct as their editors allowed. The émigré press, newspapers and magazines published by the growing community of German political refugees in France, Switzerland, and elsewhere, provided the most accurate immediate accounts of what had actually happened, drawing on sources inside Germany that the regime could not fully control and on the first-hand knowledge of people who had been directly involved. These accounts were accurate in their fundamentals, if sometimes excessive in their details, and they constituted the first draft of the historical record that professional historians would later refine and expand. The post-war treatment of the Night of the Long Knives and of Rome's role in the Nazi movement passed through phases that reflected the changing priorities of the broader project of understanding and reckoning with National Socialism. The Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946, the International Military Tribunal, at which the surviving senior leaders of the Nazi state were tried for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, did not focus centrally on the Night of the Long Knives, which predated the war and was therefore outside the specific jurisdiction the tribunal was primarily exercising. But the testimony and documentation produced at Nuremberg, and in the subsequent series of trials of specific individuals and groups, provided an enormous archival foundation for the historical work that followed. Documents were gathered and preserved, testimony was recorded, and the institutional history of the SS in particular, the organization that had carried out the purge and that had subsequently been the primary instrument of the Holocaust, was subjected to a level of documentary scrutiny that made later historical analysis considerably more grounded than it would otherwise have been. The academic historiography of the early Nazi period began to develop in a sustained way in the 1950s and 1960s as a generation of German historians trained in the post-war universities began to engage with the history of the Third Reich in ways that their immediate predecessors had been either unable or unwilling to do. The work of historians like Karl Dietrich Bracher, who published his monumental study of the seizure of power in the early 1960s, and later of Martin Brosat, Hans Mommsen, and the historians associated with the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich, established the scholarly framework within which Rome and the Night of the Long Knives were analyzed. As part of the broader history of Nazi consolidation rather than as an isolated episode of internal violence. This framework treated the purge as structurally significant, as the moment at which the complex and contested power arrangements of the early Nazi state were resolved into the more fully totalitarian structure of the late 30s, while also insisting on the importance of specific institutional and personal decisions, rather than treating the outcome as predetermined by structural forces that left individual actors no room for choice. The question of how to narrate Rome's sexuality within a broader historical account of his life and the movement he served has been handled differently by different generations and different national historiographical traditions, and the evolution of this treatment reflects broader changes in the social and cultural frameworks within which historical interpretation takes place. Earlier accounts, particularly those written in Germany in the immediate post-war period, tended either to reproduce the Nazi regime's characterization of Rome's sexuality as a matter of personal deviancy, or to treat it as a biographical footnote that explained nothing significant about his politics or his fate. Later accounts, influenced by the development of LGBTQ history as a scholarly field, and by the work of historians like Jeffrey Giles, who specifically investigated the Nazi persecution of gay men, placed Rome's sexuality in a much fuller historical context, as one element of a complex identity, as a factor in the internal politics of the Nazi leadership, and as part of the history of the systematic persecution that followed the purge. The most recent scholarship tends to treat the subject with the combination of historical precision and human seriousness that it deserves, neither using Rome's sexuality as a way of explaining or justifying his fate, nor treating it as irrelevant to a full account of who he was. The popular memory of Rome, as distinct from the academic historiography, has been shaped primarily by the documentary film tradition, by the very limited fictional treatment he has received compared to other figures of the period, and by the broader popular interest in the Night of the Long Knives as a dramatic episode in the early history of the Third Reich. He appears in documentaries about the Nazi seizure of power, usually in the role of the SA leader, who was a liability to Hitler's political consolidation, and the dramatic circumstances of his death. The resort hotel, the arrest, the refused pistol, have ensured that his story retains a certain narrative power, even in abbreviated forms. What is often missing from popular treatments, and what the academic historiography has gradually supplied, is the full complexity of his significance, not as a dramatic supporting character in Hitler's story, but as a central figure in his own right, a man whose decisions and organizational work were constitutive of the Nazi movement, rather than merely instrumental to it, and whose death was not simply an episode in Hitler's biography, but a pivotal structural event in the development of the Nazi state. The physical traces of Rome's life, the buildings he occupied, the records he left, the organizations he built, have been dispersed through the various archival and institutional transformations that Germany underwent across the middle decades of the 20th century. Stadelheim prison, where he died, is still operational as a correctional facility in Munich. The sites of the early SA activities in Munich, the beer halls, the streets, the squares, are now ordinary parts of a city that has done serious and sustained work on its own relationship to the period of the Third Reich, with memorial sites, documentation centers, and public educational programs that are among the most developed in Germany. The personal papers that survived are held in various German and foreign archives, and they have been systematically studied by the historians who have written the most thorough biographical and institutional accounts of Rome and the SA. What is held in those archives is not a complete record. The deliberate destruction of documents by the Nazi regime and the destruction of others in the bombing of German cities during the war have ensured that the picture is always partial, but it is extensive enough that the main outlines of Rome's life and significance can be established with considerable confidence, which is what this documentary has tried to do. Chapter 17, The Longer Reckoning, the question of what Ernst Roehm's life means, not what he did, which the historical record allows us to establish with reasonable confidence, but what the pattern of his life and death tells us about the forces that shaped it and the world it shaped, is not a question that history answers in the same way that it answers questions about dates and events and institutional arrangements. It is a question about significance and connection, about the relationship between individual biography and historical structure, and it requires a different kind of attention from the chronicle work of earlier chapters. The life of Roehm, taken as a whole, illuminates several things about the nature of the period he lived through that are not equally visible from other angles, and spending time with those illuminations is not mere interpretation. It is part of the honest completion of the historical account. The first and perhaps most important thing that Roehm's story illuminates is the degree to which the Nazi movement, in its formative years, was genuinely multiple, not a single unified project with a single coherent vision, but a coalition of different visions and different interests that shared enough common ground to operate together while remaining internally contested in ways that had real consequences. Roehm's vision, soldatischer nationalism, the Second Revolution, the People's Army, the military socialism of the trenches, was a real tendency within the movement, with genuine mass support among the men who filled the SA's ranks, and its defeat in the summer of 1934 was a real historical event rather than the inevitable triumph of a more powerful force over a weaker one. Understanding that the outcome was not predetermined requires taking seriously the range of possibilities that existed at various points, not as a way of suggesting that any Nazi future would have been acceptable, but as a way of understanding that the specific form the Nazi state took was the result of specific choices by specific people, which is the precondition for any serious historical accountability. The second illumination is about the relationship between personal loyalty and political systems. Roehm was, by all the evidence, genuinely loyal to Hitler in a way that was not purely transactional. He had invested 15 years of his life in a shared project, addressed Hitler in the familiar form, defended him in public when it was dangerous to do so, and continued to serve him after the Bolivia episode in a way that required swallowing substantial humiliation. This loyalty was not returned in any final sense. It was used, sustained at a level of warmth sufficient to keep Roehm useful, and then discarded when the political calculus changed. This pattern, the mobilization and subsequent destruction of personal loyalty by an authoritarian leadership, is not unique to the relationship between Hitler and Roehm. It recurs throughout the history of the Third Reich and throughout the history of authoritarian politics more broadly, with enough consistency to be called structural rather than merely coincidental. The individual figures change. The pattern endures. Roehm's story is an unusually clear and unusually well-documented instance of this pattern, which is part of why it continues to attract historical attention. The third illumination concerns the role of institutions in enabling and constraining individual political violence. Roehm was, in any honest assessment, a man responsible for organizing large-scale political violence over an extended period, and the organizations he built, the Freikorps networks of the early 1920s, the SA of the later years, were instruments of that violence in ways that their hundreds of thousands of members participated in to varying degrees. The standard historiographical question about this kind of organizational violence is the question of responsibility. How far up and how far down the chain of command does accountability run? And how do individual participants understand their own role in collective actions they might not have individually chosen? This question was central to the Nuremberg trials and has remained central to the historiography of Nazi violence ever since. Rome's specific story does not resolve this question, but it illustrates it with unusual clarity. A man at the top of an organizational hierarchy who directed violence as policy and was himself destroyed by violence as policy, leaving behind a mass of participants in the middle who were neither fully responsible in the leadership sense, nor fully absolved in the simple follower sense. The complexity is irreducible, and it is the complexity that honest history must sit with rather than simplify. The historiographical tradition that treats Rome as a symptom rather than a cause, as a product of the specific conditions of post-First World War Germany rather than an independent agent of any significance, has produced some genuine insights while missing something important. The conditions that shaped Rome were real. The empire's militarism, the trenches, the Freikorps, the Weimar crisis, the economic collapse. These conditions shaped thousands of men in similar ways and produced dozens of figures who operated in the same political space as Röhm without achieving anything like his organizational impact. What the conditions-focused account has difficulty explaining is the specific quality of Rome's, the organizational intelligence, the ability to build and sustain a mass institution, the network of relationships that gave him access to resources and personnel that others in similar structural positions could not mobilize. These are individual attributes exercised within structural conditions rather than determined by them, and they matter. The SA, in the form that it took and at the scale that it reached, was not the inevitable product of the conditions of Weimar Germany. It was the product of those conditions and of the specific person who built it. Both parts of that equation need to be in the account. The debate about whether the Night of the Long Knives represented a missed historical turning point, a moment at which a different outcome might have been possible if the purge had been resisted or had failed, is one that historians approach with the skepticism that counterfactual speculation usually deserves, but also with an awareness that the alternatives were not purely hypothetical at the time. There were German conservatives who tried, in the months before the purge, to use the SA crisis as leverage against Hitler, who believed that if they could convince Hindenburg to act on the evidence of the regime's disorder and violence, something like a constitutional correction might be possible. These efforts failed, in part because Hindenburg was too old and too committed to the deal he had made with Hitler, in part because the conservative establishment had already conceded too much to be in a credible position of resistance, and in part because the speed and decisiveness of Hitler's action in the last days of June 1934 left no time for the slower processes of institutional resistance to organize. The failure of these alternatives does not mean they were impossible. It means they were defeated by specific circumstances and specific decisions, which is how most historical alternatives are defeated. The question of what Germany's history would have looked like if Röhm had survived the purge and if the Second Revolution, in some form, had been the direction the regime took is genuinely unanswerable, but the asking of it produces certain useful observations. A Germany in which the conservative establishment had been displaced, rather than incorporated, would have been a Germany with fewer institutional brakes on the most radical tendencies of the movement. A Germany in which the army had been reorganized along Rome's preferred lines might have been a less militarily effective Germany in the specific operational terms of the Second World War. A Germany in which the SS had not achieved its post-purge dominance would have been a Germany with a different security and policing apparatus, but not necessarily a less brutal one, since the alternative would have been an SA, whose record of political violence during the Weimar period was already extensive. These observations converge on a conclusion that most serious historians of the period have reached through their own analyses. There was no likely alternative version of Nazi Germany that was meaningfully better in any moral sense. The argument for treating the purge as a turning point is an argument about the specific forms that the catastrophe took, not about whether catastrophe would have occurred. That is a genuinely important distinction, but it should not be mistaken for the identification of a lost opportunity for a Nazi Germany with a human face. The legacy question: what does Rome's story mean for how we understand our own world? Is the kind of question that responsible historians approach with caution, because the distance between historical analysis and political prescription is shorter than it looks, and the journey across it is easy to make unconsciously. What can be said with confidence is that Rome's story, taken seriously on its own terms, rather than as a decorative element of the larger Hitler narrative, illuminates several dynamics that are not specific to 1920s and 1930s Germany. The dynamics of mass organizations, built on grievance and masculine solidarity, the vulnerability of democratic institutions to forces that use democratic frameworks to undermine democratic norms, the way in which personal loyalty is mobilized and then destroyed by authoritarian leadership, and the speed with which the institutional preconditions for mass violence can be assembled when political will and organizational capacity are aligned. These dynamics have not been historically unique to Germany or to the Nazi period. They appear in different forms and different contexts across the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. The specific German story is not a template that maps cleanly onto other situations, but the underlying dynamics are real and recurring, and engaging seriously with the specific historical instance provides a kind of understanding that purely abstract political analysis cannot. Chapter 18: The End of the Story and Why. It isn't every documentary about a historical figure has to end somewhere, and the ending is always, to some degree, a fiction, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of imposing a closure on a story that continues in various forms beyond whatever frame the narrator chooses to conclude with. Ernst Roehm died on the 1st of July, 1934. That is the factual end of his personal story. But the story of what he built, what his death meant, and what the forces that shaped him went on to do in the world. That story did not end in a prison cell in Munich on a Sunday afternoon. It extended through the remaining 11 years of the Third Reich, through the Second World War and the Holocaust, through the post-war reckoning at Nuremberg, through the decades of historical scholarship that gradually assembled the full picture from the fragments that survived, and through the ongoing work of understanding how and why a modern, educated, sophisticated European society produced something like the Nazi movement, and why the mechanisms of that production remain worth understanding with precision and honesty. This final chapter is, in one sense, a return to the beginning, to the question of why this specific story matters enough to tell at this length and with this care. The answer is not that Roehm was an admirable figure whose life offers lessons about courage or conviction or the rewards of hard work? The answer is that he was a central participant in one of the most consequential political processes of the 20th century, that his specific contributions to that process are not adequately captured by the simplified accounts that are usually available, and that the honest complexity of his story, the soldier and the organizer, the loyal comrade, and the responsible party for mass political violence, the man betrayed by the movement he built, and the man whose movement would go on to produce catastrophe on a scale that defies easy comprehension, is itself historically instructive in ways that simplified versions are not. The beer halls of Munich, where Rome and Hitler first built their movement in the early 1920s, are still there in the physical geography of the city, though transformed in various ways by time and use. The buildings where they say drilled and organized and gathered in the years of Weimar's decline are still there, repurposed as offices, apartments, cultural centers, and municipal facilities. The streets where the SA marched and fought and intimidated and brutalized are still the streets of a living city walked daily by millions of people who are going about the ordinary business of ordinary lives. The physical continuity between then and now is one of the more vertiginous aspects of visiting the sites of historical catastrophe. The way the same geography hosts such radically different human activities across time, as if the ground itself is indifferent to what has happened on it, which of course it is. What is not indifferent is the human capacity for memory and for the kind of deliberate attention to historical record that prevents the past from being entirely swallowed by the present's preference for its own priorities. The historical record of the Night of the Long Knives is held in archives spread across Germany and beyond, in Munich, in Berlin, in Vienna, in Washington at the National Archives, and in various private collections that have been donated or sold to institutional repositories over the decades. These archives are not complete. The deliberate destruction of documents by the regime, the bombing of German cities that destroyed administrative buildings and their contents, and the normal attrition of paper records over 90 years have all taken their toll. But what survives is substantial, and it has been used by historians with varying degrees of access and varying degrees of methodological rigor to produce the scholarly literature that this documentary has drawn on. The process of historical investigation, reading the documents, cross-referencing the testimony, checking the claims of one source against the evidence of another, distinguishing between what can be established with confidence and what remains genuinely uncertain, is not glamorous work. It is the kind of slow, patient, careful work that produces historical understanding rather than historical entertainment. And the distinction matters. The specific uncertainty that persists in the historical record about Roehm and the Purge, and there are real areas of genuine uncertainty that honest historians acknowledge, clusters around a few key questions that the available evidence does not fully resolve. The first is the question of what Hitler privately believed about the coup plot. Whether he was genuinely convinced by the presentation Göring and Himmler gave him in late June of 1934, or whether he understood perfectly well that there was no organized coup and proceeded with the killing for purely political reasons. The second is the question of whether any serious preliminary planning for the Second Revolution was under way in the SA leadership in the months before the Purge. The evidence for this is ambiguous and has been interpreted differently by different historians. The third is the question of the full death toll of the Purge. The estimates range from around 70 at the lower end to more than 200 at the higher end, and the true number is probably not recoverable from the surviving records. These uncertainties are stated here, not because they undermine the main outlines of the story, which are well established, but because intellectual honesty about what is known and what is not known is part of what distinguishes historical documentary from historical entertainment. The people who survived the Night of the Long Knives in positions of power, Goering, Himmler, Heydrich, Goebbels, and the others who had participated in the purge or benefited from it, went on to the careers that history has documented in abundant and terrible detail. Goering commanded the Luftwaffe, oversaw the looting of occupied Europe, and was convicted at Nuremberg before taking cyanide in his cell hours before his scheduled execution. Himmler built his SS empire to its full catastrophic dimensions, oversaw the Holocaust's organization, attempted to negotiate with the Allies in the final weeks of the war without Hitler's knowledge, was dismissed by Hitler as a traitor, was captured by the British, and took cyanide in British custody in May of 1945. Heydrich, who had been central to the intelligence work that enabled the purge, was assassinated in Prague in June of 1942 by Czech and Slovak paratroopers trained in Britain, an act of extraordinary courage that cost the assassins and many Czech civilians their lives, and that removed from the Nazi state one of its most genuinely dangerous operational minds. Theodor Eicke, who shot Roehm in his cell, commanded SS concentration camp guard formations throughout the war, and was killed in a plane crash over the Eastern Front in February of 1943. Each of these trajectories is a thread in the larger fabric of the period, and none of them can be understood apart from the events of June and July 1934 that connected them. The final question this documentary leaves with its audience is not a historiographical one or a political one. It is a simpler and more persistent question about human nature, about what drives men of Rome's type, the soldier politicians, the true believers in communities of violence, the men for whom the camaraderie of the front, or the march, or the barracks constitutes the deepest form of belonging they have ever experienced. The sociological literature on this subject is substantial and does not reduce to simple answers. The experience of the First World War produced a generation of men in Germany and elsewhere who were genuinely changed by what they had been through, not in ways that made them monsters, but in ways that made certain kinds of community and certain kinds of purpose feel more real and more necessary than anything civilian life was able to offer. Roehm was an extreme case of a common pattern, shaped by the extremity of his experiences and the specific political context in which those experiences were channeled. The pattern itself, the veteran who cannot reintegrate, the man whose most meaningful relationships were forged in violence and who cannot find their equivalent in peace, is a human pattern that appears in various forms across various historical contexts, and that the history of the 20th century returned to with varying degrees of tragedy again and again. Ernst Julius Günther Roehm was born on the 28th of November, 1887, in Munich. He joined the German army at 18, served in 3 wars and 3 Freikorps campaigns, helped found the Nazi Party's paramilitary force, built the largest paramilitary organization in German history, helped deliver Adolf Hitler to the chancellorship, quarreled openly with the direction the Nazi state took. After that delivery, was arrested by the man he had addressed in the familiar form, refused a pistol in a prison cell, and was shot on the 1st of July, 1934. He was 46 years old. He had never done anything except soldier and organize, and he was killed doing neither, in a cell, by men who had been his organization's own members. History did not give him a battlefield death or a courtroom reckoning. It gave him a Sunday afternoon in Munich, a refused pistol, and a bullet. It is, in its way, a very human end to a story that had never been fully human. Always more institution than person, more ideology than individual, until the institution was stripped away and all that remained was the man and the choices he made in the last minutes of his life. He chose not to make it easy for the people who killed him. Whether that matters in the larger scheme of a story of this magnitude is a question that each person who has spent this night with the history must answer for themselves.